Blood always tasted like copper and failure. Dominic Ashford had known this since July 3, 1863, when Confederate canister shot tore his abdomen open and left him drowning in Pennsylvania mud while his cavalry company charged past his dying body. The field hospital, if you could call a requisition a hospital smelled worse than the battlefield. Gangrene laundry and the particular sweetness of bodies shutting down. 28 years old, a captain in the 6th Pennsylvania Cavalry, and Dominic was bleeding out on a table made from barn doors, while a surgeon with shaking hands told him he had maybe an hour. The surgeon moved on. Triage meant the dying got morphine and prayers, while men who might survive got the knife. Dominic understood. He'd made similar calculations on the field, which trooper to pull from the melee, which position to reinforce which flank to abandon. Command was mathematics written in blood. He just never expected to be on the wrong side of the equation. Outside, the guns had gone quiet. Pickett's charge had broken against Cemetery Ridge like a wave against stone, and now both armies were licking wounds too deep to cauterize. Dominic could hear men crying for their mothers, for God, for someone to please just make it stop. He wanted to tell them it wouldn't stop, that dying took as long as it took, that the morphine only made the waiting bearable. A shadow fell across his cot, not the surgeon returning with false hope. This man wore no uniform, just dark clothing that seemed to drink the lamplight. Pale skin, black hair, eyes that held too many midnights. He studied Dominic the way officers studied maps before ordering assaults. "Captain Ashford, you have a choice to make." Dominic tried to speak but only managed a wet cough that brought copper taste flooding his mouth. The stranger continued, voice pitched low beneath the surrounding agony. "You can die here in the next hour, or you can serve forever." That last word carried weight that made Dominic's remaining consciousness recoil. Forever was too long. Forever meant watching everyone you loved die, watching causes you believed in crumble, watching the world change until nothing remained familiar. Forever was the opposite of mercy. But dying at 28 with the war unfinished felt worse. His hand moved, barely gesturing acceptance. The stranger smiled without warmth and produced a knife, not steel. Something darker, older, wrong in ways Dominic's fevered brain couldn't process. The blade opened the stranger's wrist with surgical precision. Dark blood welled darker than any blood should be, and when it touched Dominic's lips, the barn dissolved into fire and screaming and a hunger that eclipsed every other sensation he'd ever known. Later, after the transformation completed, and the stranger explained what Dominic had become after the first terrible feeding and the realization that he'd traded mortality for monstrosity, Dominic stood over the bodies of 3 Confederate deserters who tried to rob wounded Union soldiers, their throats torn open, their blood painting his hands. The stranger who called himself Nathaniel, who claimed to be recruiting for an immortal army to fight wars mortals couldn't win, nodded approval of. "You'll do well, Captain. The cause needs soldiers who understand sacrifice." Dominic stared at his bloody hands and wondered which cause Nathaniel meant. The one Dominic had nearly died for, or the one he'd just killed for without meaning to, without choice, driven by a hunger that overrode everything, including humanity. That was July 1863, 162 years ago. The math haunted him now as he sat in his quarters at Fort Ashford, watching dawn break over the Cascade Mountains, through windows designed to withstand artillery. 162 years of wars that never ended, just changed uniforms and venues. He'd fought in them all. World War I in the trenches at Belleau Wood, watching Marines charge German positions, while he moved between them like smoke, killing with hands and teeth because bullets were too slow. World War II landing at Normandy, with the first wave pulling wounded men from the surf, while machine guns made red mist of the water. Korea in the frozen hell of Chosin Reservoir. Vietnam at Khe Sanh during the siege. The Gulf War's 100-hour ground campaign. Iraq's brutal urban warfare in Fallujah. Afghanistan's endless mountain ambushes. Every war sold as necessary as the last one, as the fight that would finally bring peace. Every war a lie written in bodies too young to know they were being spent like currency. Dominic picked up the M1911 pistol from his desk. Standard military sidearm, .45 caliber, reliable enough that the design hadn't changed in over a century. But the bullets in the magazine weren't standard. Silver blessed by a priest who didn't ask why a vampire wanted holy ammunition. One shot to the temple, That's all it would take. Silver disrupted their cellular regeneration, turned a mortal's mortal, again long enough for death to remember their names. 412 years was long enough. He'd seen enough, killed enough, buried enough. The only thing keeping him from pulling the trigger was the same thing that had kept him alive through every war. Soldiers didn't get to quit while their people needed them. And Fort Ashford, his fort, his kingdom, his responsibility needed him, because humanity had finally developed weapons that made vampires bleed. The phone on his desk buzzed. General Marcus Thorne's name appeared on the screen. Of course. Marcus never slept either, hadn't for the 320 years since Reconstruction turned him from a Confederate officer into something that outlived the country he'd fought for. They'd been fighting together, and sometimes against each other, for over a century. The closest thing Dominic had to a friend in this war that never ended. He answered without greeting. Marcus's voice carried the particular exhaustion of someone reviewing casualty reports. War room, now, we've got a situation. Dominic set the pistol down. Later, after one more war, he'd been telling himself that for decades. The walk from his quarters to the command center took him through corridors carved from the mountain itself, reinforced concrete and steel, supporting tons of rock overhead. Fort Ashford had started as an army installation during the Cold War, one of dozens of underground facilities designed to survive nuclear strikes. When the vampires purchased it in 1987, through shell corporations and brokers who didn't ask questions, the humans assumed it would become luxury storage or some eccentric billionaire's apocalypse bunker. Instead, it became the nerve center for vampire military operations across the Pacific Northwest. 800 soldiers, both vampire and human contractors, trained here, commanded from here, died from here. Dominic passed memorial plaques lining the walls. Each brass plate carried a name, rank, and date. Too many dates from the past 3 years. The border war with the Confederate States Alliance humans, who decided vampires were abominations requiring extermination, had cost them 2,400 soldiers from a force that started at 8,000. A 30% casualty rate that would have broken most armies. But vampires didn't break easily. They just got tired. The war room smelled like burnt coffee and stress. 20-foot screens covered one wall displaying tactical maps of the Oregon-California frontier, where human and vampire forces had been grinding each other down for 3 years. Red markers showed enemy positions. Blue showed their own. Gray showed contested territory where neither side controlled anything except corpses. Marcus stood at the main console, his scarred face illuminated by screens showing real-time feeds from a dozen borders. 320 years hadn't been kind for Marcus. Not in terms of physical aging, vampires didn't age past the moment they turned, but in terms of accumulating scars that refused to heal completely. His face looked like a roadmap of violence, a line across his jaw from a Confederate officer's saber in 1870, another along his temple from a silver bullet in 1943, a third across his throat from a hunter's garrote in 1980. Each scar told a story of coming too close to final death. Marcus didn't turn from the screens, just gestured Dominic closer with one massive hand. Confederate pushed across the Klamath River last night, took 3 of our forward positions. We lost 83 soldiers trying to hold ground that doesn't matter strategically. Dominic studied the map. The Klamath positions were defensive outposts, early warning stations designed to spot Confederate movements before they reached major population centers. Losing them meant Confederate forces could advance another 20 miles before encountering serious resistance. It also meant 83 soldiers, vampires who'd served for decades, some for centuries, were gone. Not dead necessarily. Vampires were hard to kill permanently, but captured, wounded, scattered, tactically neutralized. We need to counterattack immediately. Marcus continued, pulling up force disposition charts. Hit them before they can consolidate. I've got 4 companies ready to move. We can launch in 6 hours. Dominic watched blue markers shift on the screen, simulating Marcus's first assault. It would work tactically. They'd retake the positions, maybe even push further, but it would cost another 100 soldiers, maybe more. Confederate forces had new weapons now, UV artillery, that could burn through vampire healing silver fragmentation rounds that spread blessed metal through flesh, like cancer chemical agents that disrupted their enhanced senses. Fighting them wasn't like fighting humans anymore. It was like fighting an enemy that had studied vampires for centuries and finally figured out how to kill them efficiently. No, Marcus turned surprised, briefly cracking his tactical mask. Sir Dominic kept his eyes on the map, on the mathematical reality of attrition warfare. We don't have the forces for another offensive. Every soldier we spend taking those positions is a soldier we can't use defending the next attack. So we just let them advance, let them take territory we've held for 30 years. I'm saying we pick battles we can win instead of dying for symbolic victories. Marcus's jaw tightened, the muscle jumping beneath his scar tissue. That's not the Dominic Ashford I fought beside in World War I. That man understood that war requires sacrifice. That man was stupid. Took me 2 more wars to figure it out. The words came out harsher than intended, carrying 200 years of regret Dominic hadn't meant to voice. Marcus heard it anyway, studying a particular concern of someone watching a brother walk toward him. You're compromised. Have been for months, maybe longer. I'm realistic. There's a difference. Because from where I'm standing, you've been questioning every order, second-guessing every strategy, treating casualties like personal failures instead of tactical costs. Marcus moved closer, voice dropping to the register they used when discussing things that couldn't be said in front of subordinates. You're thinking about the gun again. Don't lie to me. Dominic didn't. They'd known each other too long for lies to work. Every day. Then step down. Let me run operations. Take leave, get your head straight, come back when you remember why we're fighting. I remember perfectly. That's the problem. Before Marcus could respond, the war room door opened and Captain Nathan Reeves entered, carrying a tablet, in the particular tension of someone delivering news that would complicate everything. Nathan was human, 54 years old, former Navy SEAL, 30 years of service before retiring and taking contractor work with vampire forces. He moved like someone who'd spent decades learning to live with violence, all controlled efficiency and suppressed instinct. His face carried the weathering of too many deployments lines around the eyes, from squinting through rifle scopes, scar along his jawline from an IED in Kandahar, the particular flatness in his expression that came from watching friends die in places nobody back home could locate on the map. Dominic had hired him 10 years ago after reading Nathan's service record and recognizing a kindred spirit, someone who'd fought long enough to wonder if any of it mattered. Nathan had walked into the interview looking like he'd just finished a 3-day bender, which he had celebrating his discharge with a bottle of bourbon in a crisis of conscience, and asked a single question: do you actually win these wars, or do you just fight them until everyone forgets why they started? Dominic hired him on the spot. Now Nathan set his tablet on the command console and pulled up a logistics report without preamble. Prisoner convoy from the Confederate front arrived 30 minutes ago. 40 detainees, various conditions, mostly non-combatants captured in border sweeps. Standard processing, except Commander Vincent wants you in the courtyard personally. Marcus frowned, already pulling up the prisoner manifest on his screen. Vincent doesn't request command presence for a routine process. What's different about this group? Nathan's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted, the minute tensing of someone about to deliver intel that would alter operational parameters. He didn't say, just that you'd want to see this yourself. Dominic felt something cold settle in his chest, the particular dread of knowing bad news was coming, but not knowing which flavor. In 4 centuries, he'd developed instincts for disaster. This felt personal in ways never did. The courtyard at Fort Ashford Center had been designed as a staging area for rapid deployment, large enough to accommodate 3 helicopter landing zones or 50 vehicles depending on mission requirements. Now it served as a prisoner processing station, 40 humans kneeling in formation, while vampire soldiers in black tactical gear maintained perimeter security. The detainees looked like casualties of asymmetric warfare, dirty, exhausted, wearing civilian clothes that had been torn and stained by whatever journey brought them here. Some bore the glazed expression of trauma. Others just looked empty past trauma into whatever came after. Commander Vincent Cross stood near the lead prisoner, a vampire officer Dominic had known for 90 years. Vincent had been turned during World War II, a British intelligence officer who'd gotten too close to Nazi occult research and paid the price. He'd spent the intervening decades working in vampire intelligence services, the kind of careful, methodical operator who never rushed, never panicked, and never requested command presence unless absolutely necessary. Vincent's pale face showed unusual tension as Dominic approached. He gestured toward the prisoners without speaking, letting Dominic scan the formation himself. Standard triage: 40 humans, various ages and conditions. Most would go to work details while intelligence screened them for military information. Confederate forces had been capturing civilians from border towns and pressing them into labor camps, treating their own people like expendable resources. Vampires didn't kill prisoners, that was human behavior. They just put them to work until the war ended and repatriation could be arranged. Dominic's eyes moved across the formation, mechanically cataloging faces he'd forget by tomorrow, because command couldn't afford to remember every casualty. Then his gaze locked on a figure in the third row, fifth position from the left, and the 412 years of carefully constructed emotional control shattered, like porcelain dropped from a great height. Blonde hair matted and dirty, hanging in tangles that couldn't quite hide a face carved hollow by malnutrition and systematic abuse. 27 years old by the look of her, though trauma aged people in ways calendars couldn't measure. She knelt with the mechanical precision of someone who'd learned that stillness kept you alive, that drawing attention meant punishment, that survival required erasing yourself until nothing remained that could be hurt. Her eyes, blue eyes that might have held life, once stared at the concrete without seeing it, focused on some internal landscape where the present couldn't reach. Around her neck, hanging from a leather cord, so worn it was nearly black with age and sweat, was an obsidian insignia in the shape of a cavalry unit marker. Union Army, 6th Pennsylvania Company C. The same insignia Dominic had worn at Gettysburg before dying and becoming something else. The same insignia he'd given to a 7-year-old girl 20 years ago in a burning village in Oregon. When she looked at him with gratitude, so pure it had hurt more than silver, and promised to help her somehow, someday, because that's what children believed, that promises meant something. The name surfaced from memory with perfect clarity, despite 2 decades of trying to forget Claire Morrison. 7 years old, blonde hair full of ash standing in front of him, while her village burned, and saying the words that had haunted him ever since. "When I grow up, I'm going to help you, like you helped us, I promise." And he believed her. For one moment in 140 years of cynicism and death, he'd actually believed that a child's promise could mean something in a world that broke everything eventually. The courtyard tilted. Dominic's knees didn't buckle. 4 centuries of combat discipline prevented that. But something inside him did, some load-bearing structure he'd built his entire existence around. She was here, in chains, empty-eyed and broken after what must have been 18 years of systematic degradation, because he'd failed to keep his side of the bargain. He'd promised protection. He'd given an order. And somewhere between his word and its execution, bureaucracy had decided a single village didn't matter enough to spend resources on. Vincent's voice came from somewhere distant. "Sir, are you?" Dominic moved before Vincent finished, crossing the distance to Claire in 4 strides that ate the space between them. He knelt, not crouched, not bent, but dropped to one knee like a soldier, paying respects at the grave, bringing himself level with her bowed head. 4 centuries of discipline screamed at him to maintain command presence, to not show weakness in front of subordinates and prisoners, to keep the mask in place. He ignored all of it. His hand moved with careful precision to touch the insignia at her throat, lifting the blackened leather cord gently. The obsidian felt warm, as if it had absorbed her body heat over years of constant contact. The engraving was still visible despite 2 decades of wear, the cavalry unit marker he had worn into battle, the symbol of the war he died in a country that no longer existed. She'd kept it. Through everything that must have happened, the recapture, the slavery, the passage between masters who treated humans like livestock, she'd kept this worthless piece of carved stone because it represented the only promise anyone had ever made her. Dominic's voice came out rougher than intended, 400 years of control failing completely. "Do you know who I am?" Claire's head moved fractionally, the minimum response to acknowledge a question. Her voice, when it came, had been scraped raw by disuse or screaming, or both. "No, master." That word master hit harder than any weapon Dominic had ever faced. Silver bullets hurt. Blessed blades burned. UV light could reduce vampires to screaming agony. But this exhausted whisper, carrying the weight of 18 years learning to call people master, that destroyed something in him no physical weapon could touch. He touched her chin, gently lifting her face upward until their eyes met. Blue eyes he remembered correctly, but emptied of whatever spark had animated the 7-year-old who'd stood in ashes and made impossible promises. Now those eyes held only the flat acceptance of someone who'd learned that hope was more painful than despair, that fighting back just made the beating worse, that the only safe place was the nothing inside yourself where they couldn't reach. Dominic searched her face for recognition and found none. She looked at him the way prisoners looked at all their captors, with the distant politeness of someone waiting to learn what new torture today would bring. The girl who'd promised to help him was gone, erased by whatever systematic horror she'd endured since he failed to protect her. His hand fell away. He stood every movement mechanical and turned to Vincent without seeing him. Take her to medical. Immediately. Best care we have. Private room, armed guard. No one touches her without my direct authorization. Vincent hesitated, confusion clear in his ancient eyes. Sir, she's listed as a work detail transfer. Standard processing. The words came out colder than Dominic intended, carrying 4 centuries of command authority that made Vincent step back involuntarily. I don't care what she's listed as. She goes to medical now. Full medical workup, trauma care, psychiatric evaluation if we have anyone qualified. And find me whoever processed the initial intake report. I want to know everything about where she came from. Nathan had followed Dominic into the courtyard. Professional instinct, keeping it close, the man started deviating from protocol. Now he moved to Claire's side, producing a multi-tool to cut the plastic restraints binding her wrists. The zip ties fell away, revealing raw skin underneath old scars layered over older scars and patterns that suggested prolonged captivity. Nathan didn't react beyond a slight tightening around his eyes, the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd seen enough atrocities to recognize them by signature. Ma'am, can you walk? Claire's response was to stand immediately, moving with the robotic efficiency of someone trained to follow orders without thought. She swayed slightly, malnutrition making her balance precarious, but remained upright through what looked like pure force of will. Nathan steadied her with a hand on her elbow, the touch impersonal as a medic's, and guided her toward the medical facility entrance. Marcus materialized at Dominic's shoulder, his scarred face unreadable. Want to tell me what just happened? Not here. Understood. But Dominic, Marcus pitched his voice low enough that only vampire ears could catch it. You just prioritized a single prisoner over standard protocols in front of 40 subordinates and 39 other detainees. That's going to generate questions. Let them question. I'm serious. You know her. Personally, that's going to complicate everything. Dominic finally looked at Marcus, letting his old friend see the epic behind his madness. She's someone I made a promise to 20 years ago, and I failed her. Understanding flickered across Marcus's face, the kind that came from knowing someone long enough to read between the words, the Ashford Village girl. Jesus Christ, Dominic. Get me everything Confederate intelligence has on her. Where she was captured, who held her, what happened in between. And Marcus, Dominic's voice dropped to a register that made the general's spine straighten instinctively. I want to know why our protection order for Ashford Village wasn't enforced. That was 20 years ago. Records from regional command's personnel long since rotated. Then dig through the archives until you find out. Someone decided my order wasn't worth following. I want to know who and why. Marcus nodded once, the crisp acknowledgement of a soldier receiving orders he'd execute regardless of personal opinion. He moved toward the command center, already pulling out his phone to start tasking intelligence assets. Dominic remained in the courtyard, surrounded by prisoners who carefully avoided looking at him and guards who definitely were. Command presence demanded he address the situation, explain the deviation from protocol. Protocol, reassert control. Instead, he turned and walked toward the medical facility, following Nathan and Claire. Because for the first time in decades, maybe centuries, protocol could burn. She was here. The girl who'd believed in promises. The child he'd failed to and seeing her broken like this, emptied of everything that had made her believe a 7-year-old could help a 400-year-old vampire that hollowed out something in Dominic that all his carefully maintained emotional control couldn't protect. The medical wing occupied Fort Ashford's north section, a 100-bed facility staffed by a mix of vampire physicians and human specialists who'd signed contracts requiring they not ask certain questions. Dr. Sarah Vance, the facility director, met them at the entrance with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd spent 30 years in military medicine before taking a civilian position that paid triple and required half the bureaucracy. She took one look at Claire and started issuing orders to nearby nurses without waiting for Dominic to explain. Within 5 minutes, Claire had been moved to a private examination room, hooked to monitors tracking vitals that painted a comprehensive picture of systematic abuse, severe malnutrition, dehydration, anemia, vitamin deficiencies consistent with inadequate diet over years, old fractures that had healed poorly, scar tissue from repeated injuries, markers suggesting prolonged psychological trauma. The medical readout looked like a prisoner of war dossier, except POWs usually got captured during a specific conflict with a definable endpoint. Claire had been a prisoner since she was 9 years old, passed between masters who treated her like property, because technically in Confederate States Alliance territory, that's exactly what she was. Dr. Vance pulled Dominic aside after the initial assessment, her professional mask slipping enough to show the anger beneath. She'll live, but it's going to take months of treatment, maybe longer, depending on what we find during the psychiatric evaluation. I've seen combat trauma. I've treated soldiers with PTSD from tours that broke them in ways bullets never could. But this, she gestured toward the exam room, this is sustained systematic dehumanization over nearly 2 decades. That doesn't heal quickly. Sometimes it doesn't heal at all. Dominic watched through the observation window as nurses worked with quiet competence, treating Claire's physical wounds with medications and gentle hands. She submitted to everything without resistance, moving when directed, staying still when told, giving monosyllabic responses to questions. The mechanical compliance of someone who'd learned that cooperation was the only path to survival. Do whatever it takes. Money isn't a concern. Resources aren't a concern. If we don't have something she needs, get it. Dr. Vance studied him with the particular directness of medical professionals who'd earned the right to speak truth to authority. Sir, I'll do everything medicine allows, but understand that some damage can't be undone, especially when it's this deep and lasted this long. The best we can hope for is teaching her to live with it. That assessment followed Dominic as he left the medical wing and returned to the command center. The conference room attached to the building held a dozen senior officers, all of whom had been pulled from other duties by Marcus's urgent summons. They stood as Dominic entered old protocol from military traditions that predated most of their individual existences, but he waved them down immediately. Sit, this isn't formal. I need information, not ceremony. Lieutenant Commander Vincent Cross pulled up files on the main display, his British accent crisp despite 90 years in American service. Prisoner intake documentation shows she was captured 3 weeks ago during a Confederate raid on a supply convoy near the California border. She'd been attached to the convoy as labor support, specifically laundry detail, for a Confederate military installation in Northern California. Prior to that, we're working backward through fragmentary records, but it appears she's been in Confederate territory since approximately 2007. 18 years. The math lined up with Dominic's memory of when he'd last seen her, a 7-year-old child in a burning village, making a promise she was too young to understand meant nothing in a world that broke promises like glass. 2 years later, she'd have been 9 when the second raid came, when whatever protection Dominic thought he'd provided failed to materialize. Where exactly was she captured in 2007? What happened to Ashford Village? Vincent's fingers moved across his tablet, pulling up archived reports that had been filed and forgotten in the vast bureaucracy of vampire military operations. Ashford Village, Oregon, was attacked by human raiders in late 2007. The village was marked as disputed territory in regional command records, which meant no garrison assignment, no patrol coverage, no emergency response protocols. I gave explicit orders that village was under our protection, full coverage. Yes, sir. Your order went to Regional Commander Phillips, who was responsible for Oregon Territory at that time. Phillips marked it as received, but appears to have reclassified it as disputed rather than protected during a budget review 3 months later. Marcus leaned forward, his scarred face hardening with the particular anger of a career soldier discovering administrative failure. Why would he reclassify it? Vincent pulled up internal memoranda from 2005, the bureaucratic paper trail that explained how promises died. Phillips was facing a 30% budget cut from Central Command. He needed to reduce garrison commitments across his entire region. Ashford Village was a low-priority asset, small population, minimal strategic value located in an area with low Confederate activity. Reclassifying it from protected to disputed freed up resources he could allocate elsewhere. In the second raid, different group than the first. Brennan's raiders had been eliminated, but their attack apparently drew attention to the region. A group calling themselves the Sons of Liberty hit Ashford Village in November 2007, killed approximately 30 civilians, burned most structures, took survivors as captives, sold them to Confederate labor contractors. Dominic's hands curled into fists beneath the conference table nails, cutting into palms hard enough to draw blood that would heal within seconds. Phillips had taken Dominic's direct order, an order from the Supreme Commander of Vampire Forces in North America, and overridden it for budget reasons. A 7-year-old girl had spent 18 years in slavery because some regional bureaucrat decided protecting her village wasn't cost-effective. Where is Phillips now? Vincent's expression went carefully neutral. Retired, sir. Moved to Vancouver 2 years ago. Hasn't been active in command for a decade. Marcus caught Dominic's eye with a slight shake of his head, the silent communication of someone who knew exactly what murderous impulse was being suppressed and was strongly recommending against it. Going after a retired officer for decisions made 20 years ago sets bad precedent. He ignored a direct order. He made a tactical judgment with incomplete information during a budget crisis. That's what regional commanders do. You want to court-martial everyone who's ever modified orders to fit local conditions. We'll run out of officers by Tuesday. The logic was sound. Marcus had always been better at logic than Dominic, better at seeing the tactical picture without emotion distorting the analysis. But logic didn't change the fact that Claire Morrison stood in the ashes and promised to help us who kept his worthless cavalry because it represented hope in a world that offered none, had been broken systematically because some vampire bureaucrat needed to make his numbers work. Captain Nathan Reeves, who'd been standing near the door throughout the briefing, finally spoke with the careful tone of someone introducing complication. Sirs, we have another problem. Confederate States Alliance has already sent a communication regarding the prisoner convoy. They're demanding the return of specific individuals, including Claire Morrison. Marcus pulled up the Confederate message on the display. Official letterhead, diplomatic language, aggressive, subtext. The Confederate States Alliance hereby requests the immediate repatriation of civilian detainees captured during recent border operations, including but not limited to one, Claire Morrison, human female age 27, currently held at Fort Ashford. The Confederacy is prepared to offer prisoner exchange at a rate of 30 captured vampire soldiers for this individual's return. The room went silent. 30 vampire soldiers was an extraordinary exchange rate, 10 times the normal ratio for prisoner swaps. Confederate command was explicitly valuing one human woman as worth more than an entire vampire platoon. That kind of asymmetric exchange meant either Claire carried intelligence value Dominic couldn't see, or Confederate forces wanted her for reasons that had nothing to do with normal military practice. Wow. Dominic's question cut through the silence. Why is she worth 30 of our soldiers to them? Vincent pulled up supplementary intelligence reports connecting threads that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. Confederate propaganda has been circulating stories about an Ashford martyr for the past 6 months. A human woman who survived 18 years of vampire slavery who represents hope for human resistance against vampire oppression. The stories are vague on specifics, but heavy on symbolism. We dismissed it as standard propaganda until now. You're saying they want her for propaganda purposes? Partially, but sir, there's more. Vincent's voice dropped, carrying the weight of intel that changed operational parameters. We've received reports from intelligence assets in Confederate territory suggesting they're developing biological weapons, specifically weapons targeting vampire physiology. The program requires human test subjects with specific genetic markers. The implications settled over the room like fallout, invisible but lethal. Biological weapons meant Confederate forces had moved beyond conventional warfare into existential threat territory. Vampires could survive almost anything. Bullets, blades, fire if they move fast enough, but engineered pathogens targeting their unique cellular structure. That was a threat nothing in 4 centuries of warfare had prepared them for. Marcus leaned back in his chair, tactical mind visibly working through scenarios. If they're developing bioweapons, they need test subjects. Humans with unusual blood composition, old families. What are old families? Nathan asked the human in a room full of vampires requesting translation of vampire-specific terminology. Vincent answered before Marcus could. Centuries ago, certain human lineages served as mediators between vampire covens and human settlements. They negotiated peace treaties, managed disputes, facilitated coexistence. Over generations, interbreeding occurred. Not enough to create hybrids, but enough to leave genetic markers. These families, called old families or old blood, carry trace vampire DNA. And that matters because their blood chemistry is unique. It carries natural resistance to vampire compulsion, slightly enhanced healing, and most importantly, Vincent pulled up biological schematics that look like they'd been stolen from classified research databases. Antibodies that can neutralize vampire cellular regeneration. If weaponized properly, old blood could theoretically be used to create compounds that make vampires mortal. Dominic felt the pieces click into place with sickening clarity. Confederate forces weren't demanding Claire's return for propaganda. They wanted her because she carried genetic markers that could be synthesized into a weapon capable of neutralizing vampire immortality. Every vampire in North America, every vampire on Earth could be made mortal, vulnerable, killable with conventional weapons if Confederate scientists successfully weaponized her blood chemistry. How do we know she's old blood? We don't, not with certainty, but the Ashford region has historical documentation of old families settling there in the 1800s. Claire Morrison's genealogy, what we've been able to reconstruct from fragmentary records, traces back to known old blood lineages in England before emigration. Combined with Confederates' unusual interest in her, specifically the probability is high. Marcus stood moving to the display showing Confederate force dispositions along the border. This changes everything. If they want her for weapons development, they won't take no for an answer. We're looking at a raid on Fort Ashford, soon. Probably within 72 hours. Agreed. We need to increase security, move her to a secure location, possibly transfer her off-site entirely until we can verify. No. Dominic's voice cut through the tactical discussion with absolute finality. She stays here, under my direct protection. The room shifted uncomfortably. Senior officers exchanged glances that carried volumes of unspoken concern. Finally, Marcus spoke with the careful tone of someone addressing a superior they suspected was making catastrophic mistakes. Dominic, I understand you feel responsible for what happened to her, but keeping her here makes Fort Ashford a target. 800 soldiers at risk because you want to protect one hero who may be the key to a weapon that could destroy our entire species. She's not a weapon. She's someone I made a promise to. She's both. And right now, the weapon part matters more strategically. We're not trading her back to people who'll dissect her in a laboratory. Then we're not trading 30 of our soldiers back either. Men who've served for decades, who have families and responsibilities and lives worth living. You're prioritizing a stranger over people who've bled for you. The accusation hung in the air, true enough to cut deep. Dominic knew Marcus was right from a purely tactical standpoint. 30 vampire soldiers was a significant force multiplication. Refusing the exchange meant those soldiers stayed in Confederate captivity, probably dying there because prisoner exchanges only worked when both sides valued prisoners enough to negotiate. But accepting meant sending Claire back to the same slavery she'd just escaped, only worse this time, because now she'd be a laboratory specimen instead of just property. Nathan, who'd been watching the exchange with the careful neutrality of someone caught between Vampire Command, structured debates, finally spoke. Sirs, there's a third option. We accept the exchange but sabotage their weapons program from inside. Send her back with a tracking device. Infiltration team follows. We extract the other test subjects and burn the facility. That puts her back in their hands, with no guarantee we can get her out before they kill her, Dominic said flatly. Yes, sir, but it protects Fort Ashford, recovers our soldiers, and potentially destroys their weapons program. The math works. The math always works when you don't count certain casualties. Nathan met Dominic's eyes with the direct honesty of someone who'd made too many hard calls to soften them with euphemism. Sir, I'm not saying it's right. I'm saying it's the option that keeps the most people alive. That's what command means. Making choices where all the options are bad and picking the least terrible one. Dominic recognized the philosophy because he'd lived by it for centuries. Every war he'd fought, every battle he'd commanded, every attack he'd ordered had involved mathematical calculations about acceptable losses. You couldn't win wars without spending lives. The question was always which lives you spent and whether the objective was worth the cost. For 400 years, Dominic had answered that question with cold tactical precision. But now looking at intelligence reports showing Claire Morrison's genetic markers might be the key to vampire extinction, he couldn't make the math work anymore. Before he could respond, the door opened and Dr. Vance entered without waiting for permission, her medical authority overriding military protocol. "Sir, we need to discuss the patient's condition. Privately." Dominic followed her out of the conference room into an adjacent office that provided acoustic isolation for sensitive discussion. Doctor Vance closed the door and turned with the particular intensity of someone about to deliver diagnosis she wished she didn't have to. The physical damage is extensive but manageable. Malnutrition, dehydration, multiple old injuries that healed poorly but won't kill her. The psychological damage is worse. She's exhibiting severe PTSD, dissociative symptoms, learned helplessness consistent with prolonged captivity. Her responses to questions are minimal mechanical, showing significant cognitive avoidance of anything requiring emotional processing. Can it be treated? Yes, with time, patience, and specialized care. But sir, there's something else you need to know. Dr. Vance pulled up blood work results on her tablet graphs showing molecular analysis Dominic didn't have medical training to interpret. Her blood chemistry is unusual. Not enough to be obvious without deep analysis, but once you know what you're looking for, the markers are clear. She's carrying genetic sequences that shouldn't exist in pure blood humans. Vampire DNA fragments integrated at the chromosomal level. She's old blood. More than that, she's one of the purest examples I've seen in 30 years of studying vampire genetics. Her lineage must trace back to families that had extensive contact with vampires for multiple generations. The implications. I know the implications. Confederate wants to weaponize the blood. Mr. Vance's expression hardened. Then you understand that keeping her here is dangerous. If Confederate intelligence knows what she carries, they'll do whatever it takes to get her back. Raid this facility, kill everyone in the way because genetic material this pure is irreplaceable. How many other old blood carriers exist? Unknown. The families scattered centuries ago intermixed with broader human populations. Genetic markers dilute over generations. Most modern descendants probably don't carry enough vampire DNA to be useful for weapons development. She pulled up a map showing population genetics across North America, red markers indicating potential old blood concentration areas. Our intelligence suggests Confederate forces have been systematically identifying and capturing individuals from high-probability regions. If Claire Morrison is here, there are probably others in their custody already. Dominic studied the map, seeing the outlines of a program that had been running for years without Vampire Command recognizing it. Confederate forces hadn't just been fighting a conventional war. They'd been conducting genetic warfare, quietly assembling biological weapons capability, while vampire leadership focused on tactical victories and territorial control. By the time anyone realized what was happening, Confederate scientists would have synthesized compounds that could neutralize vampire immortality, deploy them via aerosol or water supplies, and turn a 3-year border war into an extinction campaign. How long would it take to weaponize old blood? If they have genetic material, competent scientists 6 months to develop a viable compound, another 3 to manufacture sufficient quantities for large-scale deployment. We're probably looking at less than a year before they can field it operationally. The timeline meant Confederate forces were already well into development, possibly approaching deployment readiness. That urgency explained why they were offering 30 vampire soldiers for Claire's return time was more valuable than troops at this stage. Every day they didn't have her genetic material was a day their weapons program fell behind schedule. Thank you, doctor. Continue treatment and keep me informed of any changes in her condition. Sir, one more thing. Dr. Vance's voice carried the particular hesitation of someone about to cross professional boundaries into personal observation. She's been asking about you. Not directly, she's too traumatized for direct communication. But she keeps touching the insignia around her neck and watching the door like she's waiting for someone. I think on some level she remembers you. That possibility followed Dominic back to his quarters, where the M1911 with its silver bullets still sat on his desk exactly where he'd left it. 412 years of accumulated regret crystallized into a single image, a 7-year-old girl promising to help him, believing that promises meant something, keeping his worthless cavalry insignia through 18 years of hell because it represented hope in a world that systematically destroyed hope in everyone it touched. He'd failed her completely. Given an order, assumed it would be followed and never checked because command meant trusting subordinates to execute directives. Then she disappeared into Confederate slavery, while Dominic fought other wars and forgot about one village in Oregon that didn't matter strategically. Now she was here broken and empty, carrying genetic markers that made her a weapon both sides would kill to possess. The phone buzzed, Marcus predictably, because his oldest friend had always known when Dominic was spiraling. Stop thinking about the gun. We've got bigger problems. What now? Confederate response to our refusal of prisoner exchange just came through. They're giving us 72 hours to reconsider. After that, they'll consider it an act of war justifying escalated military action. That's diplomatic language for, we're going to raid your facility and take her by force. Let them try. Dominic, we can't defend against a major Confederate assault, not with our current force levels. They'll bring everything, UV artillery, air support, chemical weapons. We'll lose hundreds of soldiers defending one human who may not survive the rescue anyway. Then we'll lose them, but I'm not trading her. Silence stretched across the connection, filled with decades of shared history and increasing divergence about what that history meant. Finally, Marcus spoke with the flat tone of someone delivering a decision to fracture the relationship. I'm calling an emergency war council. Full command staff. We're going to vote on whether to accept Confederates' prisoner exchange offer. You're challenging my authority. I'm trying to save you from yourself and save 800 soldiers from dying because you can't let go of guilt over something that happened 20 years ago. Marcus's voice softened fractionally, carrying genuine concern beneath the tactical disagreement. She's not your daughter. She's not your responsibility. She's a casualty of a war that was already lost when you made that promise. Sometimes the kindest thing is accepting that you can't save everyone. I didn't try to save everyone. I tried to save one village, and I failed because I trusted the bureaucracy to follow my orders. Then learn from it and don't make the same mistake twice. Don't let 800 soldiers die because you're trying to fix something that's already broken beyond repair. The call ended. Dominic sat in silence, surrounded by 4 centuries of military decorations and medals from wars nobody remembered, holding a phone that had just delivered his oldest friend's declaration of opposition. The fracture in Vampire Command wasn't about Claire Morrison specifically. It was about competing philosophies that had been growing incompatible for decades. Marcus believed in pragmatic survival, in making hard calls that kept most people alive, even if it meant sacrificing the few. Dominic used to believe the same thing, had believed it through 2 world wars and a dozen smaller conflicts. But somewhere between Korea and Vietnam and Iraq, the math stopped working for him. All those acceptable losses added up to a number too large to accept. Claire Morrison represented every acceptable loss he had ever calculated, every civilian casualty marked as regrettable but necessary, every promise broken, because tactical objectives mattered more than individual lives. He could let her go, trade her for 30 soldiers who'd serve faithfully, make the smart call that saved the most people. But if he did that, if he made that calculation one more time, he wasn't sure he'd be able to look at himself in any mirror ever again. The walk to the medical wing took him through quarters that had become too familiar, past memorial plaques bearing names of soldiers who died making hard calls because that's what soldiers did. Fort Ashford ran on those calculations, on the accumulated mathematics of acceptable sacrifice. Maybe that's what made it different from human military installations. Vampires had centuries to accumulate regret instead of just decades, centuries, to watch the bodies pile up and wonder if any of it meant anything. Bodar Vance met him at the medical wing entrance. She's stable but sedated. The psychological evaluation suggested keeping her under mild sedation until the immediate trauma responses settle. She was experiencing flashbacks, panic attacks, whenever anyone approached too quickly. The sedation helps. I need to see it. Sir, I'm not sure that's... I need to see it. Vance studied him with the direct assessment medical professionals used when evaluating whether someone was about to make their job harder, then stepped aside. Room 3, don't touch her without warning. Don't make sudden movements. And if she starts showing distress, you leave immediately. The room was small, designed for privacy rather than efficiency, with monitoring equipment arranged discreetly to avoid the sense of being observed. Claire lay in a bed that looked too large for her diminished frame of V-lines, running clear fluids that would rehydrate and stabilize her after years of nutritional neglect. Someone had cleaned her, changed her into hospital clothing that actually fit, brushed the tangles from her hair. Without the dirt and desperation, she looked younger than 27. She looked like a child playing dress-up in adult trauma. Dominic pulled a chair to her bedside and sat watching the steady rise and fall of her breathing that the monitors confirmed was normal for someone recovering from systematic abuse. The obsidian insignia rested on her collarbone, the leather cord they'd somehow missed during cleaning. They'd probably tried to remove it and discovered she became agitated, so they'd left it because choosing battles was standard medical practice. His own hand moved to his chest to where that same insignia had hung 162 years ago when he'd charged up Cemetery Ridge with the 6th Pennsylvania Cavalry and gotten shot out of his saddle. He'd given it to her because a 7-year-old had looked at him at a vampire covered in blood from killing ladies and seen something worth promising to help. That innocence had hurt more than blessed Silver because it reminded him of why he'd chosen to become a soldier in the first place, before immortality made him forget that war was supposed to have purpose beyond perpetuation. Claire's eyes opened suddenly, the sedation apparently insufficient to keep her completely under. They tracked around the room with careful precision, mapping exits and threats like a prisoner learning a new cell. Then they found Dominic and locked on with an intensity that suggested the sedation had lowered her defenses more than her awareness. She stared at him for long seconds, breathing accelerating slightly despite the chemical calm. Her hand moved to the insignia at her throat, fingers closing around it in a gesture so familiar it must have been repeated thousands of times over 18 years. Protection, talisman, the only thing she had that meant anything in a world that had taken everything else. Dominic leaned back slightly, trying to present as non-threatening as possible for someone who was fundamentally a predator. "I'm not going to hurt you." Her lips moved, but no sound came. She tried again, voice barely above a whisper. "I know you." The words hit with unexpected force. No, not new, present tense, recognition breaking through whatever walls trauma had built. "Yes, the fire, the village, you saved us." Each word came with effort, like she was pulling them from deep water. Her fingers moved on the insignia, tracing the engraving she must have memorized years ago. "I did. You promised." She trailed off the thought, incomplete, or perhaps too complex to navigate through sedation and trauma. "I waited." Those two words contained 18 years of hope turning into betrayal. "I waited. For rescue that never came, for protection that evaporated, for someone to remember that a 7-year-old had been promised safety and that promises were supposed to mean something. She'd waited and he'd forgotten, and the gap between those two realities was filled with horror he couldn't undo. "I'm sorry." Claire's eyes closed again, either from sedation or exhaustion or the simple inability to process the apology. "They came back 2 years later. You weren't there." "I know. I called for you, I screamed for you, but you didn't come." Each word was a blade going between his ribs, precisely aimed at the spaces between the armor 4 centuries had built. He wanted to explain about bureaucracy, about budget cuts, about regional commanders making pragmatic decisions with incomplete information. But those were excuses that mattered to command structures, not to 9-year-olds watching their mothers die while screaming for help that never arrived. "I failed you." Yes, the simple agreement hurt more than accusation would have. She wasn't angry, wasn't demanding explanation or revenge. She was just acknowledging the fact he had promised protection, and that protection had failed, and she'd spent 18 years learning that promises meant nothing. Now here he was, sitting beside her bed, offering apologies that couldn't change what happened or return what she'd lost. Claire's breathing evened out as sedation pulled her back under. The last thing she said before unconsciousness claimed her was barely audible. "I kept my promise. I was going to help you. I kept it." Then she was asleep, leaving Dominic sitting in darkness, with the weight of her kept promise crushing his chest. She'd held on to his insignia through 18 years of slavery, kept the promise a 7-year-old made, because that 7-year-old believed in promises. And he'd forgotten her completely until she appeared in his courtyard carrying proof that not everyone was as cynical as 400 years of war had made him. The Emergency War Council convened at 0200 hours, all senior command staff present, despite the hour because sleeping was a luxury nobody at Fort Ashford could afford during wartime. The conference room felt different this time, carrying tension that went beyond normal tactical disagreements. This wasn't a debate about force allocation or strategic priorities. This was about whether command would support Dominic's decision or override it, whether loyalty to a 400-year-old vampire king outweighed pragmatic calculations about force preservation. Marcus stood at the head of the table, opposite Dominic's position. The symbolic arrangement made it clear this was opposition rather than counsel. Gentlemen, we're here to address a critical decision point. Confederate States Alliance has offered prisoner exchange 30 of our captured soldiers for one human civilian currently in our custody. By standard protocol, this decision would be command's discretion. However, given the strategic implications and the unusual circumstances, I'm calling for a council vote. This is a coup. Dominic's voice carried 4 centuries of command authority, but it couldn't stop what was already in motion. This is accountability. You're letting personal guilt override strategic judgment. That makes you compromised. Council has the right, has the obligation to intervene when command judgment is impaired. The argument that followed was brutal in its clinical precision. Marcus presented the tactical case Confederate forces would raid Fort Ashford within 72 hours to take Clare by force. Defending against that assault would cost hundreds of casualties. Even if they repelled the attack, Confederate would continue escalating until they either got Clare or Fort Ashford was destroyed. Meanwhile, 30 vampire soldiers remained in Confederate captivity, facing torture or execution, while Dominic prioritized one human he'd known for 30 minutes 20 years ago. Lieutenant Commander Vincent Cross supported Marcus with intelligence assessment. Claire Morrison's genetic material could be synthesized into a weapon capable of neutralizing vampire immortality. Confederate scientists are probably already working on this with samples from other old blood carriers. Whether we return her or not, the weapons program continues. But if we return her, we get 30 soldiers back and buy time to develop countermeasures. The tactical math is clear. Captain Nathan Reeves, sitting between the vampire officers with the uncomfortable awareness that his human perspective might not count for much in this debate, still spoke with quiet conviction. Sirs, with respect, I've been on both sides of prisoner exchange negotiations. I've traded enemy combatants for American soldiers. I've left local assets behind because extraction wasn't tactically viable. Every time I told myself the math worked, that getting our people home justified the compromise. But I still remember their faces, the ones we traded away, the ones we left. At some point, the math stops mattering and you have to ask what kind of army you're building. An army that survives, Marcus said flatly. That's what matters, survival. Everything else is luxury we can't afford during existential war. Is it survival if we become exactly what they say we are? Monsters who treat humans as expendable. We are monsters, Captain. Pretending otherwise doesn't change what we do to survive. Dominic listened to the debate with the detached awareness of someone watching his fraction of real time. Marcus wasn't wrong about the tactical analysis. Confederate would escalate until they got what they wanted, or Fort Ashford was destroyed trying to deny them. 30 soldiers would remain in captivity, possibly dying there because Dominic couldn't let go of guilt over one failed promise. The math worked. It always worked when you calculated in casualties rather than names. But some part of him, the part that had survived 412 years of war by finding things worth protecting, couldn't make the calculation this time. Claire Morrison represented every promise he'd ever made and failed to keep every civilian marked as acceptable collateral, every justification he had used to make violence bearable. If he traded her now, if he accepted the logic that her suffering mattered less than tactical optimization, He wasn't sure he'd have any reason left to keep fighting. The wars would continue. The math would always justify one more compromise. And eventually he'd wake up realizing he'd spent 4 centuries becoming exactly what he'd died fighting against. The vote was called at 0347 hours. 12 senior officers, each representing major command functions, delivering judgment on whether Dominic's decision to keep Claire Morrison constituted sound leadership or impaired judgment requiring intervention. Marcus, we accept Confederates' exchange offer. Return. Claire Morrison, recover our soldiers, prioritize force preservation. Vince, we accept the exchange. Helena Graves, the civilian advisor who served anti-wars for 3 centuries, spoke with quiet weight. We refuse the exchange. The precedent of trading prisoners for weapons development sets strategic costs that outweigh tactical benefits. Nathan Reeves, we refuse the exchange. The vote continued, each officer adding their judgment to the balance. When it concluded, the count was 8 votes for accepting Confederates' offer, 4 votes for maintaining Dominic's refusal. Command consensus had overridden command authority. Marcus delivered the verdict with the particular regret of someone executing a decision he believed necessary, but hated. Council vote supersedes command discretion in cases of impaired judgment. Will contact Confederate command immediately, accept their exchange offer, arrange logistics for prisoner transfer. You're sentencing her to death in a laboratory. We're saving 30 soldiers and preventing Fort Ashford from becoming a battlefield that kills hundreds more. That's what command requires. Dominic stood slowly, feeling 412 years of accumulated discipline, holding him upright when everything else wanted to collapse. Then you're in command now. Execute the decision yourself. Dominic, I said you're in command. I'm done. You want to trade her, do it, but I won't be the one who delivers her. He walked out of the conference room through corridors that suddenly felt like prison walls past soldiers who'd heard about the vote and carefully avoided his eyes. Command meant making hard calls. Marcus was right about that, but it also meant living with the consequences of those calls. And Dominic had accumulated 4 centuries of consequences that made sleep impossible and made the silver bullet look more attractive every day. The medical wing was quiet at 0400 hours, skeleton staff monitoring patients, while most personnel tried to get whatever rest the war allowed. Dervance looked up from her station as Dominic entered, read his expression with medical accuracy, and quietly gestured toward Claire's room. She didn't ask questions. Doctors learned early that sometimes people needed to sit with the dying or the condemned without explanation. Claire was awake, staring at the ceiling with the flat awareness of someone who'd learned that sleep just brought nightmares. She turned her head as Dominic entered, tracking him with eyes that held more clarity than earlier. The sedation had worn off, or she'd metabolized it faster than expected. Either way, she was conscious enough to understand when he sat in the same chair as before. They're sending me back. Not a question. Somehow she'd already figured it out. Maybe she'd heard staff discussing it. Maybe she'd just learned over 18 years that good things didn't last and rescue was always temporary. Either way, she knew. Yes. When 72 hours, Confederate is arranging logistics for prisoner transfer. Claire's hand moved to the insignia at her throat again. That protective gesture that probably kept her sane through horror. Dominic, will you take this back before I go? I don't want them to have it. The request destroyed something in him. She wasn't asking for rescue or demanding explanation or even expressing anger at being traded away. She just wanted to return the one piece of hope she'd carried for 20 years, wanted to give it back to its owner before returning to captivity. As if the insignia mattered more than her own life. As if keeping his promise, the one she'd made, not the one he'd broken, was more important than survival. Keep it, it's yours. But you gave it to me for, she paused, struggling with memory or emotion or both. I was supposed to help you, I promised, but I can't do that if they take me back. You already helped me. How I didn't do anything. I just survived. That's not helping. Dominic leaned forward, choosing words carefully because they might be the last conversation they'd have. You kept a promise for 20 years when everyone else I know breaks them before the ink dries. You held on to hope when everything around you was designed to destroy it. You reminded me that maybe promises still matter. That's more help than I've gotten from anyone in 400 years. Claire absorbed this with visible effort, trying to reconcile his words with whatever internal narrative 18 years of slavery had taught her about her own worth. Finally, she spoke with the particular clarity of someone who's accepted death and found it less frightening than anticipated. If I go back, they'll kill me. Not right away. They'll do tests, take blood, try to make weapons. But eventually they'll kill me. That's what happens to people like me. I know. So why are you letting them do it? The question held no accusation, just genuine curiosity about the mathematics that valued 30 soldiers more than her life. Dominic could have explained about force preservation, about tactical priorities, about how command required making calls, where all options were terrible, and you chose the least terrible one. But those were rationalizations that made the math bearable, not truths that changed the fundamental reality. They were trading her life for strategic advantage, and he was letting it happen because 8 senior officers outvoted him. Because I've been commanding soldiers for 300 years, and I forgot what matters. Forgot that individual lives aren't just numbers and casualty reports. Your council vote reminded me that forgetting costs more than remembering. Claire studied him with an intensity that suggested she saw more than he wanted to show. You're going to kill yourself after they take me. I can see it. You have that look my mother had before she died, like you're already gone, just waiting for your body to figure it out. The observation hit with unexpected accuracy. She'd only been conscious around him for maybe 30 minutes total, but somehow she'd read him completely. Maybe trauma taught you to recognize death in others. Maybe spending 18 years learning to survive required understanding when people had stopped trying. Maybe. Don't, please. If you die, then everything I kept this for, her hand closed around the insignia, doesn't mean anything. I kept it because I thought someday I'd find you and help you like you helped us. If you die, then I was just holding on to garbage for 20 years. The plea was more effective than any tactical argument Marcus could have made. Dominic had spent 412 years surviving for various reasons. Duty, vengeance, simple, inability to let go. But he'd never had someone explicitly ask him to live, to not give up, to keep going, because his existence mattered to them personally. Not in ways that translated to strategic value or command necessity, just in the human way of wanting someone to survive because they'd shown you kindness once. Before he could respond, alarms began shrieking throughout Fort Ashford. Not the routine alert that signaled drills or incoming communications. The emergency klaxon that meant hostile forces had breached the perimeter, that Fort Ashford was under attack, that every soldier needed to reach combat positions immediately because the war had just arrived at their doorstep. Nathan burst through the medical wing entrance tactical vest, already strapped on, rifle in hands. Sir, Confederate forces hitting the perimeter. 72 hours before they're here now. The medical wing's emergency lighting kicked in automatically, bathing everything in red that turned Claire's pale face the color of arterial spray. Dominic was moving before conscious thought engaged muscle memory from 100 battlefields overriding everything else. Nathan had already cleared the doorway, rifle up, moving toward the command center, with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this too many times to waste motion on panic. Claire sat up in bed despite the IV lines, eyes wide, but not with fear. Something else. Recognition maybe of a situation she'd been waiting for since the moment she woke in this too-soft bed. Her hand went to the insignia at her throat, fingers closing around it like a talisman. They came for me. Not a question. Statement of fact delivered with the flat certainty of someone who'd learned that good things ended and rescue was always temporary. Dominic paused at the threshold, every instinct screaming to reach the command center, to coordinate defense, to do what 4 centuries of military service had trained him for. But looking at Claire, small and fragile and absolutely unsurprised that violence had found her again, something in him fractured. Stay here. Lock the door after I leave. Don't open it for anyone except Dr. Vance or me. They won't stop. Not until they have me. You know that. The accuracy of her assessment made responding pointless. Dominic left without promising safety. He couldn't guarantee moving through corridors that had transformed from administrative spaces into combat zones. Soldiers rushed past in full tactical gear, vampires and human contractors mixing in the organized chaos of a military installation under attack. The difference between Fort Ashford and human bases was speed. Vampires move faster. Processed information, faster, killed faster. But Confederate forces had spent 3 years learning to compensate for supernatural advantages, and the distant thunder of UV artillery suggested they had brought enough firepower to level the playing field. The war room erupted with activity screens displaying real-time feeds from perimeter cameras and defensive positions. Marcus stood at the tactical display, his scarred face illuminated by red markers showing Confederate force positions. Too many red markers. Far too many for the skeleton crew that manned Night Watch. Report! Dominic's voice cut through the controlled chaos, 4 centuries of command authority, making everyone snap to attention automatically. Marcus didn't look away from the display. 200 operators, maybe more. They hit all 3 perimeter gates simultaneously with UV artillery and chemical dispersal. We've lost exterior defenses on the east and south gates. North is holding but barely. Casualties. He pulled up a list that was growing faster than Dominic could read. 43 confirmed dead in the first 10 minutes. Another 70 wounded, many killed because the exposure is limiting regeneration. 43 dead in 10 minutes. The math was catastrophic. At this rate, Fort Ashford would be overrun within the hour, all 800 personnel killed or captured because Confederate command hadn't waited 72 hours like they'd promised. They'd attacked immediately, probably gambling that vampire leadership wouldn't expect such aggressive timeline compression. Vincent appeared on one of the communication screens, his British accent clipped with stress. Sir, they're not trying to take the fort. They're punching straight for the medical wing. This is an extraction operation, not an assault. Can we hold them? Not if they're willing to spend bodies. They've got numerical advantage and weapons that neutralize our regeneration. We can kill 3 for every one of ours they take, but the math still doesn't work. Dominic studied the tactical display. Seeing the reality, Vincent was too professional to state. Explicitly, Confederate forces would reach the medical wing within 30 minutes, regardless of how many soldiers Fort Ashford spent trying to stop them. The only variable was how many vampires died in the attempt. Acceptable loss, as Marcus would call it. Necessary sacrifice for strategic objective. Except the strategic objective was protecting one human woman whose genetic material could theoretically be weaponized into species extinction. The mathematics kept coming back to the same equation: trade Claire's life for however many soldiers Confederate would kill, taking her by force. Save the many by sacrificing the few. Command 101, the calculation Dominic made 1,000 times across 4 centuries of warfare. Except this time making that calculation felt like putting the silver bullet to his own temple and pulling the trigger. Reinforce the medical wing. Pull everyone from non-essential positions. We hold them there. Marcus turned from the display, something dangerous flickering in his ancient eyes. That's suicide, Dominic. Concentrating forces in a defensive position while they have artillery superiority and chemical weapons. We'll lose 200 soldiers holding 1 quarter. Then we lose them. For what? For 1 human, for your guilt about a promise you made when horses pulled cannons. The accusation carried enough truth to cut deep, but Dominic had spent the past 4 hours, maybe the past 4 centuries, learning that truth didn't make decisions easier. It just made living with them harder. Execute the order, General. Marcus's jaw tightened, muscle jumping beneath scar tissue, but he turned back to his console and began issuing commands that would redeploy Fort Ashford's defensive posture from distributed perimeter security to concentrated interior defense. It was tactically sound if the objective was protecting a specific location. It was suicide if Confederate forces had the firepower to break through anyway, which intelligence suggested they did. Nathan materialized at Dominic's shoulder, his tactical vest stained with something dark that might have been blood. Sir, we've got a problem. The corridor leading to the medical wing is the only approach that doesn't require them to breach multiple hardened doors. They're going to funnel through there, and it's going to be a meat grinder for whoever's defending it. I'll defend it. Sir, I said I'll defend it. Get me a rifle and whatever silver ammunition we have left. Then organize a human contractor team to provide covering fire. Vampires will take point because we heal faster. Nathan studied him with the particular concern of someone who'd seen too many officers make decisions based on emotion instead of logic. This is a suicide mission. You know that. I've done suicide missions before. This one matters more. The look Nathan gave him suggested profound disagreement with that assessment, but the captain was professional enough to execute orders even when he thought they were catastrophically stupid. He moved off already coordinating with the human contractors who'd signed up for hazard pay, but probably hadn't expected to defend a hallway against 200 Confederate operators equipped with vampire-killing weapons. Dominic descended to the medical wing level, collecting soldiers as he went. 30 vampires total, all of whom had heard about the council vote and knew exactly what they were being ordered to die for. None of them questioned it. Soldiers didn't question orders in combat, not if they wanted to survive. But Dominic could see the calculation in their eyes, the mathematics of acceptable loss running through everyone's internal spreadsheets. They were being asked to die, not might die, defending one human who most of them had never met. The corridor leading to the medical wing was 40 feet long, reinforced concrete walls, overhead lighting that would provide excellent fields of fire for defenders and terrible cover for attackers. Confederate forces would have to funnel through it 5 abreast at most directly into concentrated defensive fire. It should hold. Tactically, mathematically, it should hold long enough for reinforcements or negotiated withdrawal or some deus ex machina that changed the tactical picture. Except Dominic had fought in enough wars to know that should rarely survive contact with enemy who were sufficiently motivated. And Confederate forces were motivated by the prospect of acquiring genetic material that could neutralize vampire immortality. That kind of strategic prize justified spending hundreds of operators if necessary. The first Confederate team hit the corridor 12 minutes later, moving with the coordinated precision of special forces who trained specifically for vampire engagement. UV floodlights preceded them, burning through vampire flesh before bullets could. Dominic felt his skin start blistering immediately, the particular agony of cells dying faster than his supernatural healing could compensate. But 412 years of combat experience meant he could function through pain that would have incapacitated younger vampires. He fired through the UV glow, each round precisely aimed at center mass of advancing operators. 3 went down before they could return fire. 5 more took their place, moving through the bodies of their fallen comrades with the mechanical efficiency of professionals who'd accepted casualties as operational cost. The firefight lasted 90 seconds, ending when the first Confederate wave withdrew, leaving 8 bodies and 2 wounded operators who couldn't extract in time. Dominic counted his own casualties. 4 vampires down, 3 wounded badly enough that their healing couldn't keep pace with silver-laced bullet damage. The exchange ratio favored defenders, but not by enough margin to matter. Confederate command could afford to spend 8 operators taking out 4 vampires. They had numbers and tactical patience. Fort Ashford had neither. Marcus's voice crackled through Dominic's radio, carrying the flat tone of someone delivering tactical assessment he wished he didn't have to. Second wave forming up. Estimated 60 operators this time. They're going to overwhelm your position. Then we hold anyway. With what you've got, 26 combat effective soldiers left. 60 Confederate operators with UV support will go through you like tissue paper. What's the alternative, Marcus? Let them walk into the medical wing and take her. Yes, that's exactly the alternative. Trade 1 prisoner for ending the assault, save everyone else. It's simple mathematics. The mathematics. Always the mathematics reducing human lives. Vampire lives are numbers that could be optimized and traded and spent like currency. Dominic had lived by those mathematics for so long that questioning them felt like heresy. But staring down a corridor filled with dead soldiers who'd followed his orders into suicide defense, he couldn't make the calculation work anymore. She's not a prisoner. She's someone we're supposed to protect. She's leverage we can't afford to spend 800 lives protecting. Dominic, I'm ordering you to stand down. Let them through. You're welcome to relieve me of command and execute that order yourself. The silence that followed carried decades of friendship fracturing under tactical disagreement. Finally, Marcus spoke with the careful precision of someone choosing words that couldn't be taken back. You're compromised. Have been since she arrived. I'm calling another emergency council vote to remove you from active command. Do it after we survive the next wave. There won't be another wave if you just The radio went dead, not cut off deliberately, but destroyed by something that hit Dominic's tactical vest hard enough to crack ribs despite vampire durability. Silver fragmentation grenade, he realized, distantly feeling the blessed metal spreading through his torso like cancer. His healing factor stuttered, trying to isolate and expel the silver, but there was too much, too dispersed. He went to one knee, rifle clattering from hands that suddenly couldn't maintain grip. The second wave hit while he was compromised. 60 Confederate operatives moving with mechanical precision of people executing a plan they'd rehearsed 100 times. They came through UV glare and chemical smoke firing as they advanced, spending ammunition like they had infinite supplies. Which they probably did, given the tactical patience that suggested this was a prepared operation rather than hasty response. Dominic tried to stand to return fire, to do anything except kneel uselessly, while soldiers under his command died defending a position he'd ordered them to hold. But silver poisoning had reduced his supernatural abilities to barely human levels, and barely human wasn't enough against Special Forces operators who trained specifically for this engagement. Nathan appeared from somewhere, grabbing Dominic's tactical vest and dragging him backward with strength that suggested adrenaline overriding common sense. Return fire came from the human contractors, covering their withdrawal with disciplined volleys that dropped 3 more Confederate operators. But it wasn't enough. It was never enough when attackers had numerical advantage and willingness to spend lives. The medical wing's emergency doors slammed shut, blast-resistant, steel ceiling with hydraulic finality. Dominic could hear fighting on the other side, the particular thunder of close-quarters combat, where bullets were too slow and hands became weapons. His soldiers were dying because he'd ordered them to defend one human who most military calculus said wasn't worth defending. Dr. Vance was suddenly there, cutting away his tactical vest with medical scissors, exposing the silver-contaminated wounds that had turned his torso into a roadmap of trauma. She worked with the efficient calm of someone who treated battlefield injuries under fire before injecting something that made the pain recede enough for thought to function. The fragments are too deep. I can't extract them here. You need surgery. How long until I'm combat effective? Never if you don't get proper treatment. Hours even with our best care. You're done for this fight. The tactical reality settled over him like burial shroud. He was compromised, silver poisoned, unable to defend anything, while Fort Ashford burned around him. 412 years of combat experience rendered useless because one lucky grenade had landed close enough to distribute blessed metal through his body. Marcus appeared in the medical wing, his armor scorched from UV exposure but otherwise intact. Eastgate is breached. They're inside the main facility. We've lost over 80 soldiers trying to hold them. This ends now, Dominic, one way or another. We can still? There is no we can still. You're down. Your position is overrun. Confederate forces are 3 minutes from reaching this room, and there's nothing stopping them except sealed doors that won't hold against shaped charges. Dominic tried to stand to assert command authority through sheer force of will, but his legs were exploded. Silver poisoning had reduced him to barely functional, unable to lead or fight or do anything except watch as everything he'd tried to prevent happened anyway. Claire appeared in the doorway of her room, still wearing hospital clothing, IV, line torn free from her arm. She'd heard everything Dominic realized. The fighting, the casualty reports, the tactical assessments delivered in clipped military language that translated to, "We're losing because of you." She walked forward with the particular steadiness of someone who'd made a decision and accepted its consequences. Past Dr. Vance's attempt to restrain her, past Nathan's careful positioning to intercept if necessary, straight to where Dominic knelt with silver fragments poisoning him from inside. "Let them have me." The words came out calm, almost peaceful. Not resignation, but active choice, the first decision she'd been allowed to make since arriving at Fort Ashford. "No, you're dying to protect me. All these soldiers," her gesture encompassed the medical wing, the fort beyond the 80 casualties and counting, "dying because you can't let go of a promise you made to a 7-year-old who doesn't exist anymore. She exists. You kept the promise. You kept my insignia for 20 years. Claire touched the obsidian marker at her throat one final time, then lifted the leather cord over her head. She held it out to Dominic with hands that shook slightly, but remained steady enough for the transfer. I kept it because it was all I had, but it's yours. It was always yours. And I can't watch more people die because of something that happened when I was too young to understand promises cost blood. Marcus stepped forward, recognizing operational opportunity when it presented itself. I'll escort her to the main gate. Confederate command will withdraw when they have what they came for. The assault ends, casualties stop accumulating. We salvage what's left of Fort Ashford. She goes back to a laboratory where they dissect her for genetic material. Yes, that's the cost of ending this. One life for 800. The mathematics work. Claire knelt carefully, bringing herself level with Dominic's face. The insignia dangled from her fingers between them, obsidian catching emergency lighting in ways that made it look like it was absorbing darkness. The mathematics always work when you don't count certain lives. I know. I've been on the wrong side of those calculations for 18 years, but maybe this time I get to choose which side I'm on. She pressed the insignia into his hand, fingers lingering just long enough to make sure he had it, then stood and turned to Marcus with the straight-back posture of someone who'd decided dignity mattered more than survival. Take me to the gate, General, before more soldiers die for bad mathematics. Marcus gestured to two vampire soldiers who moved to flank Claire, not restraining, but escorting. Standard prisoner transfer, except prisoners usually fought or pleaded or showed some emotional response beyond calm acceptance. Claire just walked each step measured and precise, the mechanical movement of someone who'd learned that fighting made things worse, and compliance was the only path to managing suffering. Dominic tried to stand silver poisoning be damned, but his body had finally reached the limits of supernatural durability. Doctor Vance and Nathan held him down. With professional efficiency, the doctor already preparing surgical equipment to extract the fragments that were slowly killing him from inside Saul. Let me go. You need to survive, Nathan said flatly. Sir, with respect, you're done. Let them finish this. Through the open doorway, Dominic could see Marcus leading Claire toward the main gate, could hear him issuing commands that halted defensive operations and prepared for prisoner transfer. The fighting slowed, then stopped as Confederate operators received orders to stand down and wait for the package they'd come for. 83 casualties, the number had climbed, while Dominic was compromised for one human woman who'd kept his promise better than he'd kept his. Marcus's voice came through the facility-wide intercom, professional and cold. All Fort Ashford personnel cease fire. We are transferring custody of a single prisoner to Confederate forces in exchange for immediate withdrawal. Repeat, cease fire and prepare for enemy extraction. The announcement echoed through corridors where soldiers had been dying 30 seconds ago, carrying the particular relief and shame of knowing rescue came at someone else's cost. Acceptable losses, the phrase that made military operations bearable. Except Dominic had spent 4 hours, maybe 4 centuries, learning that acceptable was just another word for bearable, and bearable didn't mean right. Dr. Vance's scalpel cut into his torso, fishing for silver fragments, with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this too many times. Each extraction sent new waves of pain through nerves that weren't responding properly to vampire healing. Nathan held him down, applying pressure that would have broken human bones, but was necessary to keep a silver-poisoned vampire from thrashing. Stay still, sir. If she hits something vital while you're moving, you'll bleed out before the healing catches up. Dominic forced himself to stillness, watching through the doorway as Marcus and Claire disappeared down the corridor toward the main gate. He'd failed her. 20 years ago, through bureaucratic negligence, and now through tactical incompetence that got 83 soldiers killed, trying to protect what command calculus said wasn't worth protecting. The insignia burned in his hand, not literally, but metaphorically, carrying the weight of a kept promise exchanged for a broken one. She'd held it for 20 years, kept faith that promises meant something in a world designed to break faith in everyone it touched. And he'd repaid that faith by letting her walk back into captivity, because keeping her alive cost too many other lives. Vincent appeared in the medical wing, his to show genuine distress. Sir, you need to see this. Confederate command is broadcasting the transfer. They're streaming it live. The main display in the medical wing flickered to life, showing footage from what must have been Confederate drone coverage. The main gate stood open, UV floodlights creating a zone of artificial day that made vampires unable to approach. Confederate operators had formed a corridor between their position and Fort Ashford's gate, weapons ready, but held at low ready instead of firing position. Professional courtesy for prisoner transfer, the kind of tactical restraint that suggested both sides still followed rules despite 3 years of brutal warfare. Marcus walked Claire through the gate, flanked by 2 soldiers who maintained respectful distance. They weren't restraining her, Dominic realized. They were providing honor guard, treating her like a prisoner of war instead of disposable asset. Small dignity meaningless in the larger calculation, but apparently some part of Vampire Command still believed in treating prisoners with basic respect. The Confederate officer who met them at the midpoint wore colonel's insignia and carried himself with the particular bearing of career military who'd seen enough combat to earn real authority. He studied Claire with professional assessment, then nodded to Marcus in acknowledgement that protocols had been followed. The transfer took 30 seconds. Marcus stepped back. Claire stepped forward. Confederate soldiers closed around her in protective formation. The drone footage caught her face in profile, calm, composed, utterly empty of emotion, before the formation moved away from view. The Confederate column withdrew in disciplined order, taking their prize, and leaving Fort Ashford's defenders to count casualties and wonder if the mathematics really worked when you calculated in souls instead of bodies. The display went dark. The medical wing settled into silence, broken only by the steady sound of Dr. Vance's instruments extracting silver fragments from Dominic's torso. Each piece removed brought incremental relief, supernatural healing, slowly reasserting itself now that the blessed metal wasn't actively poisoning him. In an hour, maybe 2, he'd be functional again. Combat effective, ready to continue commanding soldiers in a war that just demonstrated command judgment meant less than tactical necessity. Nathan spoke quietly, his voice carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who'd fought too long without knowing what they were fighting for. Sir, I've been in this situation before. Afghanistan village full of civilians, Taliban coming with superior numbers. We had to choose between defending the village and getting our people out alive. I chose our people. Told myself it was the right call, that command required prioritizing American lives over local assets. He paused, staring at something beyond the walls. I still remember their faces. The village elders who'd helped us, who'd trusted us when we promised protection. Watching us leave while Taliban moved in. The mathematics were perfect. We extracted with minimal casualties, but I've never stopped seeing those faces. You're saying I made the wrong call. I'm saying there is no right call, just the one you can live with. And sir, Nathan met his eyes directly. I'm not sure you can live with this one. The assessment was probably accurate. Dominic had survived 412 years by finding causes worth fighting for, people worth protecting, promises worth keeping. Those justifications had carried him through 2 world wars and a dozen smaller conflicts had given him reasons to keep going when immortality made continuing pointless. But watching Claire walk back into captivity, calm and dignified, and fundamentally broken by people who'd spent 18 years teaching her that hope was dangerous, had destroyed something in him that silver poisoning couldn't touch. Dr. Vance extracted the final fragment, dropping it into a metal tray with the others. 13 pieces of blessed silver each, small enough to seem insignificant, collectively lethal if left untreated. She sealed the wounds with surgical precision, then stepped back to survey her work. You'll live. Healing should restore full function within 6 hours. But Commander Ashford, she used his title with the particular formality of medical professionals delivering unwelcome diagnosis. Silver poisoning leaves traces even after extraction. You'll be more vulnerable to blessed metals for the next month, possibly longer. That means no frontline combat, no situations where silver weapons are likely. Understood. Understood. She left without further comment, recognizing that some wounds couldn't be treated with medicine or surgery or anything medical science offered. Nathan helped Dominic into a sitting position, moving with the careful support of someone handling wounded, who might be physically whole but fundamentally compromised in ways that mattered more. Marcus returned 20 minutes later, his armor showing scorch marks from UV exposure, but his scarred face carefully neutral. He stood in the doorway like someone approaching a wounded animal, uncertain whether offering help would be accepted or attacked. Confederate forces have withdrawn completely. We're conducting casualty assessments and damage surveys, but preliminary count is 83 dead. 112 wounded Eastern Perimeter destroyed medical wing, damaged but functional. Could have been much worse. could have been prevented. Yes, by making the call you couldn't make 2 hours earlier. Trading her then would have saved 83 soldiers. But you needed those soldiers to die first before accepting what was always going to happen anyway. The accusation carried enough truth to destroy whatever remained of their friendship. Marcus wasn't wrong about the tactical timeline. Confederate forces would have accepted prisoner transfer before the assault, during the assault, or after the assault. The only variable was how many casualties Fort Ashford accumulated before making the inevitable trade. Dominic's refusal to accept reality earlier had cost 83 lives that could have been preserved by pragmatic calculation. I'm relieving you of command, effective immediately. Council vote passed 9-3 while you were in surgery. Helena tried to defend you, but after tonight's casualties, she's the only one willing to question the mathematics. Dominic absorbed this without surprise. Command meant accepting responsibility for decisions, and his decisions tonight had killed 83 soldiers defending a position that couldn't be held for a prisoner who couldn't be kept. Relief from command was the lightest consequence command failure typically received. In earlier wars, earlier armies, he might have faced court-martial or execution for incompetence that squandered lives so completely. Understood. Who's taking command? I am, temporarily until Council appoints permanent replacement. First order of business is negotiating with Confederate command to recover our dead and arrange proper burials. Second is assessing whether Fort Ashford remains defensible or needs evacuation. Third is determining what to do with you. Court-martial. Retirement. You're done, Dominic. 412 years of service, and it ends with you relieved of command for tactical incompetence driven by emotional compromise. Not the legacy anyone wanted, but it's the one tonight's casualties bought. Marcus left without waiting for response, his massive frame disappearing down corridors that suddenly felt like prison. Nathan remained his human presence, less judgmental than the vampire officers who'd spent the past 3 hours watching Dominic's command decisions kill their brothers. Sir, I'm heading out. Contract's fulfilled, and after tonight, I'm not sure I want to renew. I understand. But before I go, Nathan produced something from his tactical vest, small and wrapped in cloth. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing the obsidian insignia Claire had returned. She gave this to you. Thought you'd want it since it seems to matter more than tactics or strategy or any of the shit we usually fight for. He set the insignia on the medical table beside Dominic, then walked out without the formal military courtesies that usually mark departure. Nathan was civilian contractor, not enlisted soldier. He could walk away whenever combat stopped making sense, a luxury Dominic had never had in 4 centuries of service. The insignia sat exactly where Claire had placed it in his hand, smooth black stone, with engraved cavalry marker, barely visible in emergency lighting. 162 years old, carried through Gettysburg in all the wars after given to a 7-year-old who believed promises meant something. She'd kept it for 20 years, held it through systematic degradation designed to destroy everything, including memory of ever being treated like a human. And when forced to choose between her own survival and soldiers dying to protect her, she'd returned it and walked back into captivity with dignity that put 4 centuries of Dominic's military service in shame. He picked up the insignia, feeling the weight that had nothing to do with physical mass. Promises meant something to her. Even when everything else was stripped away, even when survival required becoming nothing, she'd held on to the idea that maybe someone somewhere kept their word. And he'd proven her wrong twice. Once through bureaucratic failure 20 years ago, once through tactical incompetence 3 hours ago. The M1911 with silver bullets was somewhere in his quarters, locked in the desk drawer where he'd left it before everything started. Loaded, ready, waiting for the moment when continuing stopped making sense and finishing became the only logical conclusion. 412 years of fighting for causes that didn't matter, protecting people who died anyway, keeping promises that broke under pressure. Maybe tonight was that moment. Maybe failing Claire twice in 20 years was the universe's way of saying some debts couldn't be repaid, some mistakes couldn't be corrected, some promises shouldn't be kept because keeping them cost more than breaking them. 83 soldiers had died tonight defending her. 83 names added to the memorial plaques that already held too many names from too many wars nobody remembered. The mathematics worked perfectly when you calculated in casualties instead of souls. Confederate got their genetic material for weapons development. Fort Ashford got to survive with minimized losses. Command structure got restored under leadership that made pragmatic decisions based on tactical reality instead of emotional compromise. Everyone won except the one person who had kept faith that promises still meant something in a world designed to break faith. Dominic stood slowly, silver poisoning, still limiting his movement, but no longer preventing function. The walk to his quarters took him through corridors where cleanup crews were already working, collecting bodies and weapons and shell casings that told stories about tonight's failure. Soldiers saluted as he passed old habit that hadn't caught up to relief from command, but their eyes carried judgment that didn't require words. He'd gotten their brothers killed for nothing. Tactical incompetence dressed up as principled stand sentiment masquerading as strategy. His quarters felt smaller than before, walls pressing in with the weight of 4 centuries accumulated in too small space. The desk drawer opened with familiar resistance, revealing the M1911 exactly where he'd left it. He picked it up, feeling the comfortable weight of a weapon that had been service standard longer than most armies existed. Checked the magazine out of habit, finding it fully loaded with silver rounds that would do what silver always did when applied to vampire flesh with sufficient force. One shot, temple or heart, didn't matter much. Silver would disrupt cellular regeneration long enough for death to remember he existed. And after 412 years, death probably had a long list of grievances about Dominic postponing. Quick, clean final. No more wars, no more failures, no more watching people die because his judgment couldn't separate tactical necessity from emotional compromise. The insignia sat on his desk where he'd placed it after leaving the medical wing, smooth obsidian, catching lamplight in ways that made it look alive. Dominic picked it up with his free hand, holding both objects of the weapon that would end his existence, and the token Claire had kept through 20 years of systematic horror, feeling the weight of choices that had led here. She'd asked him not to. Her last request before Confederate soldiers took her: don't kill yourself, don't make the insignia meaningless, don't let everything she'd endured amount to nothing. But that request assumed continuing matter, that surviving another war and another century of wars would somehow justify tonight's casualties or redeem 20 years of failure. It assumed promises still meant something even after being broken twice. The gun's barrel pressed cold against his temple, silver loaded and ready. 412 years compressed into this moment. This choice between continuing and concluding, between accepting that some debts couldn't be repaid and believing maybe one more war might matter. The mathematics said continuing was pointless. Confederate had Claire would synthesize her genetic material, would deploy weapons that made vampires mortal. Fort Ashford had lost 83 soldiers and gained in nothing except proof that sentiment couldn't survive contact with reality. But the insignia burned against his palm, not literally, never literally, just metaphorically carrying the weight of a 7-year-old's promise kept better than his own. She believed for 20 years, held faith through systematic degradation designed to destroy faith in everything. And even knowing what awaited her in Confederate laboratories, she'd walk calmly dignified, choosing sacrifice over watching more soldiers die. Maybe that choice meant something. Maybe promises kept despite knowing they cost everything mattered more than promises broken because the cost seemed too high. Maybe 412 years of failure weren't quite finished teaching lessons about what separated soldiers from monsters who happened to follow military protocols. The gun lowered slowly, not decision so much as postponement. One more day, one more chance to see if anything could be salvaged from tonight's wreckage. One more promise, this time to Claire. Instead of from her, the insignia wouldn't become meaningless. Her sacrifice wouldn't be wasted, and somehow tactically impossible but ethically necessary, he'd find a way to get her back before Confederate scientists had finished what 18 years of slavery had started. Confederate territory stretched 200 miles south of Fort Ashford's ruined perimeter across terrain that shifted from Pacific Northwest forests into California's northern valleys. The research facility occupied what had once been a Cold War-era Army installation decommissioned in the 1990s and quietly purchased by interests that preferred operations far from oversight. Claire had been conscious of the entire transport, watching through armored vehicle windows as forests gave way to agricultural land, gave way to fenced compounds that looked like they'd been designed by people who understood that some research required isolation from ethical constraints. The intake process was clinical. Medical examination blood draws tissue samples collected with professional efficiency by technicians who'd clearly done this before. No one spoke to her except to issue instructions. Sit here, extend your arm, open your mouth. They treated her like a specimen being cataloged, which was probably accurate. Genetic material, first person, second if at all. The containment cell was 8 feet by 10 concrete walls, reinforced door with observation window, medical equipment arranged with the sterile precision of laboratory space. A bed, a toilet, fluorescent lighting that never turned off completely. Not the worst place she'd been held over 18 years, but definitely purpose-built for keeping people who weren't expected to leave. The insignia was gone. They'd removed it during intake, cataloged it as personal effects. Claire tried not to think about that loss, about the one object that had connected her to the promise she'd kept, even when keeping it meant carrying worthless stone through systematic degradation. It was just a thing she told herself, just carved obsidian, with engraving that mattered only because she decided it mattered. But losing it felt like losing the last piece of whoever she'd been before Raiders came the second time. They taught her that promises were luxuries slaves couldn't afford. Colonel William Hargrove entered 3 hours after her arrival, moving with the careful bearing of career officers who'd earned authority through competence rather than politics. 68 years old, gray hair cut, military, short, West Point ring, catching fluorescent light. He carried himself like men Claire remembered from Confederate camps, the ones who'd commanded respect even from prisoners, because their authority came from demonstrated capability rather than arbitrary cruelty. He pulled a chair to the center of the cell and sat studying her with professional assessment that felt different from the technician's cataloging. They'd seen specimen. He saw something else. Asset, maybe. Weapon, strategic resource that justified 200 operators and 83 enemy casualties to acquire. Miss Morrison, I apologize for the circumstances, but I'm sure you understand this is necessary. Claire understood that people who apologized while imprisoning you were usually more dangerous than the ones who didn't bother with pretense. She'd learned that in year 3 of captivity, when a master who claimed to regret necessity had been the worst of all 5 she'd endured. You're going to use my blood and make weapons. Kill vampires. I heard the briefings at Fort Ashford. Hargrove's expression shifted surprise, briefly cracking professional reserve. You're remarkably well-informed for someone who was catatonic. I learned to listen. 18 years of slavery teaches you that survival means knowing what people want before they ask for it. The assessment carried enough truth to make Hargrove pause, recalibrating his approach. He'd probably expected traumatized victim requiring gentle manipulation. Instead, he'd gotten someone who'd survived systematic horror by developing situational awareness that bordered on precognition. My son was Army Rangers. Good soldier, believed in duty and honor. 20 years ago, his unit was attacked by vampires during a border patrol. He survived the initial assault, but was bitten infected. The transformation was beginning when he asked me to. Hargrove's voice caught professional control fracturing. When he asked me to kill him before he became one of them. Claire watched him struggle with memory that clearly hadn't dulled despite 2 decades. Some wounds didn't heal, just scabbed over enough to function. So you did. And you've spent 20 years building weapons to justify that choice by making sure no other father has to murder his son. Yes, the honesty was almost refreshing. Most people who did terrible things dressed them up in necessity or greater good or strategic imperatives that made atrocity palatable. Hargrove just admitted he was driven by grief that had metastasized into vendetta. My blood won't bring him back. No, but it will prevent other families from experiencing what mine did. Your genetic markers, the old blood your ancestors carried, contain antibodies that neutralize vampire cellular regeneration. We've been developing a compound called Daybreak that, when deployed as aerosol, will make every vampire in the exposure zone mortal. Vulnerable to conventional weapons. Killable. That's genocide. That's pest control. Vampires are parasites pretending to be people. They drink blood, manipulate humans, treat your species like livestock. Removing them is ecological correction. Claire had heard variations of this argument from Confederate officers who'd commanded camps where she'd been held. The dehumanization was a necessary psychological step before implementing systematic violence. You couldn't exterminate people, but you could eliminate parasites, pests, things that looked human but fundamentally weren't. The logic was airtight once you accepted the initial premise, and Hargrove had clearly accepted it 20 years ago while putting a bullet in his infected son's head. When do you deploy it? 48 hours. We've been synthesizing compounds using genetic material from other old blood carriers we've acquired. Your blood is the final component. We need the purest sample we found. Once we extract sufficient quantities and complete synthesis, we'll deploy in 12 major vampire population centers simultaneously. Estimated 80% mortality within the first week. The timeline meant Confederate scientists had been working on this for years, systematically identifying and capturing old blood carriers, while vampire intelligence failed to recognize the pattern. By the time Fort Ashford realized what was happening, Confederate forces were already approaching deployment readiness. Claire was just the final piece, the genetic material that would let them manufacture compounds in quantities sufficient for continental-scale genocide. How many humans will you kill in the process? Hargrove's expression went carefully neutral. Collateral damage is estimated at minimal levels. The compound targets vampire-specific cellular markers. That's not what I asked. Before Hargrove could respond, a technician entered carrying a tablet that displayed data Claire couldn't interpret from her position. The technician's face showed the particular tension of someone delivering news their superior wouldn't want to hear. Hargrove read the screen, jaw tightening incrementally with each line. Sir, the latest modeling shows broader spectrum effects than initially projected. The compound targets regenerative cellular structures indiscriminately. That includes human stem cells, bone marrow production, certain immune functions. Projected collateral in deployment zones is... The technician paused, clearly struggling with numbers he didn't want to voice. 15 to 20% of human populations with vulnerable genetic markers. The silence that followed carried weight that made the concrete walls feel closer. 15 to 20% collateral damage meant millions of Americans dead in deployment. Cancer patients, transplant recipients, people with autoimmune disorders, anyone whose immune system or cellular regeneration fit profiles that Daybreak targeted. Hargrove's weapon wouldn't just kill vampires. It would slaughter humans by the millions in pursuit of species that numbered maybe 10,000 total across North America. That's unacceptable. Hargrove's voice had gone flat, all emotion scraped away, leaving only command assessment. Rerun the models. There must be refinement protocols that reduce collateral below 5%. Sir, we've run 17 iterations. The antibodies in old blood target regenerative processes at a fundamental cellular level. There's no way to make the compound vampire-specific without losing efficacy. If we narrow the targeting parameters, it won't affect vampires reliably. If we maintain current parameters, human casualties are unavoidable. Claire watched Hargrove process information that destroyed whatever moral framework he'd constructed around his vendetta. He'd spent 20 years building a weapon to avenge his son, to protect humanity from vampire predation, to ensure no other father faced the choice he'd made. And that weapon would kill millions of humans in the process, including based on the technician's careful reading of data people with medical conditions that made them vulnerable to compound cellular structures. Does Tyler appear on the vulnerability assessment? The technician's expression answered before his words. Yes, sir. Your grandson's leukemia treatment and bone marrow transplant place him in the highest risk category. If Daybreak is deployed in his region, estimated mortality probability is 97% within 72 hours of exposure. 20 years of weapons development, billions in research funding, systematic capture, and exploitation of old blood carriers, all leading to this moment. Hargrove's weapon worked perfectly and would kill his grandson along with millions of other humans in pursuit of eliminating 10,000 vampires. The mathematics didn't work anymore. They'd never work, Claire realized. Genocide math never worked when you started counting the people you loved among the casualties. Hargrove stood slowly, moving like someone whose spine had just been replaced with something more fragile. Continue synthesis using current samples. Don't extract additional material from Miss Morrison until I've reviewed the collateral assessment personally. He left without looking at Claire. Professional control, barely maintaining against the reality that his crusade would murder the only family he had left. The technician followed tablet clutched like evidence at court-martial, leaving Claire alone in a cell that suddenly felt less like prison and more like tomb. She was the final component in a weapon that would kill millions. Her blood, her genetic markers, her ancestors' decision to mediate between vampires and humans. Centuries ago, all of it culminating in systematic slaughter that would dwarf anything vampires had done to humanity. Dominic would come for her. The certainty settled into her chest with weight that had nothing to do with hope and everything to do with knowing someone well enough to predict their mistakes. He'd failed her twice, felt guilt about both failures, and would absolutely attempt suicidal rescue mission to prove promises still meant something. It was tactically stupid, strategically pointless, and completely inevitable, because 412 years of military service had apparently not taught him that some promises cost more than keeping them. She hoped he'd stay away, hoped someone at Fort Ashford would restrain him, lock him up, prevent whatever catastrophic gesture he was planning. But hope was dangerous, and Claire had learned over 18 years that hoping for rescue just made betrayal hurt worse when rescue never came. Fort Ashford's command structure had reorganized with the efficient ruthlessness of military institutions continuing despite leadership changes. Marcus had assumed command formally appointed by council vote that recognized his pragmatic judgment was exactly what Fort needed after Dominic's catastrophic failure. The casualty assessment was final now. 83 dead, 112 wounded eastern perimeter, requiring complete reconstruction, medical wing damage but functional. Acceptable losses counted only numbers and ignored the names attached. Dominic had been officially relieved at 0600 hours, 12 hours after Claire's transfer. No ceremony, no formal proceedings, just orders delivered via tablet that his command authority was revoked. His access to tactical systems terminated, his presence in the command center no longer required or desired. Retired with honors, the order said. Recognition of 4 centuries of service despite recent judgment failures. Translation, he was being politely removed from active duty before his compromised decision-making killed more soldiers. He'd spent the past 18 hours in quarters that felt more like cell than residents watching tactical displays he could no longer access, and reviewing intelligence reports he no longer had clearance to read. The insignia sat on his desk, obsidian surface reflecting lamplight in ways that made it seem alive. Claire had kept it for 20 years. He'd had it for 18 hours and already felt its weight crushing him. Nathan Reeves appeared at 0100 hours, entering without knocking because civilian contractors didn't follow protocol about announcing presence. He looked like he'd spent the 18 hours since Claire's transfer doing exactly what Dominic had been doing, reviewing decisions that couldn't be changed, and wondering if different choices would have produced better outcomes. Sir, I've been doing reconnaissance. Confederate research facility is 200 miles south of current garrison estimated at 100 security personnel hardened perimeter, but the facility itself is above ground, not a bunker. That means assault is viable if you have sufficient force and willingness to accept casualties. Dominic looked up from the insignia, reading Nathan's expression with the accuracy of someone who'd commanded soldiers long enough to recognize when subordinates were offering options they knew were terrible. Marcus won't authorize rescue mission. Council vote was clear. Claire Morrison is acceptable loss in exchange for not risking more soldiers. I'm not suggesting you ask permission. The words hung in quarters that suddenly felt smaller, carrying implications that crossed from tactical disagreement into mutiny. Nathan was proposing Dominic conduct unauthorized military operation against facility, holding prisoner, that Vampire Command had officially traded away. It violated every protocol, every chain of command structure, every principle that made military organizations function. It was also exactly what Dominic had been planning since Claire walked through the gate with dignity that put 4 centuries of his service to shame. That's desertion, court-martial offense. You're already retired. Can't court-martial someone who's not in service. They'll find a way, and anyone who goes with me faces the same charges. Nathan pulled a tablet from his jacket displaying roster that made Dominic's chest tighten. I've been asking you quietly. 12 human contractors willing to volunteer. They saw what happened, saw her walk out to save soldiers she didn't know. That meant something to them, and sir, Nathan's voice dropped, carrying information he clearly didn't want to deliver. Marcus wants to see you, command center. He said, come alone. The walk through corridors Dominic had commanded for 80 years felt different now that he was civilian instead of officer. Soldiers still saluted old habit, but their eyes held pity that hurt worse than judgment. He'd been relieved of command for incompetence driven by emotional compromise. They knew it. He knew it. The entire fort knew 83 soldiers had died because their commander couldn't separate tactical necessity from guilt about broken promises. Marcus stood in the command center surrounded by displays showing Confederate force dispositions and intelligence assessments. He didn't turn when Dominic entered, just continued studying tactical data with the focused intensity of someone who'd taken responsibility for keeping 800 soldiers alive despite recent casualties. You're planning rescue mission. Don't bother denying it. Nathan's been recruiting contractors and you've been accessing classified intelligence through channels you think I don't monitor. Dominic had expected, surveillance hadn't expected Marcus to confront him directly. If you're here to stop me, you're wasting your time. I'm here because... Marcus turned finally, his scarred face showing exhaustion. Because I've been reviewing the happenings, the assaults, the casualties, the decisions that led to 83 soldiers dying. And I realized something I should have seen earlier. That I'm compromised, that I am, that council is, that everyone who voted to trade her was so focused on mathematics, we forgot to count what matters. The admission hit harder than any tactical criticism. Marcus had been the voice of pragmatism, the general who made hard calls based on numbers instead of sentiment. Hearing him question those calculations suggested something fundamental had shifted in how he assessed command decisions. She walked out with dignity none of us deserved, Marcus continued, voice rough with something that might have been shame. Watched 83 soldiers die defending her, then chose to end it herself because she couldn't stand watching more people pay for her survival. That's not acceptable loss. That's someone we failed completely twice, and she still kept better faith than any of us. So you're authorizing rescue mission? No, council would override me immediately and probably relieve me for the same compromised judgment that got you removed. But I'm not stopping you either, and Dominic. Marcus moved to the tactical display, pulling up intelligence that shouldn't have been accessible to retired officers. If you're going, anyway, go prepared. Confederate facilities, specifications, garrison strength, security protocols. Everything intelligence has gathered in the past 18 hours. The data download appeared on Dominic's personal tablet, gigabytes of classified information that would absolutely result in court-martial if anyone discovered Marcus had provided it. But his oldest friend was apparently willing to risk that consequence because sometimes the mathematics stopped mattering and you had to make decisions based on what you could live with instead of what tactics recommended. Thank you. Don't. If you get killed doing this, I'll be the one explaining to council why I let our former commander conduct unauthorized raid that got himself and 12 contractors killed for one prisoner we'd already traded away. Just, Marcus's voice dropped, carrying weight of 2 centuries, fighting together, come back. Both of you. Prove that keeping promises matters more than tactical optimization. The team assembled at 0400 hours in a warehouse 3 miles from Fort Ashford's perimeter, chosen because it was far enough from official installations that surveillance wouldn't immediately flag gathering of armed personnel. 12 human contractors, all veterans with special operations backgrounds, all of whom had signed contracts that explicitly forbade unauthorized military operations. Nathan stood at the center, laying out mission parameters with the clinical precision of someone who'd planned high-risk extractions before. Target is 200 miles south Confederate research facility designated Charlie 7. Estimated garrison 100 security personnel, but intelligence suggests only 30% are on duty at any given time. We hit at noon. One of the contractors, Jackson 48 former Delta Force, spoke up with the skepticism of someone who'd seen too many bad plans dressed up as tactical brilliance. Noon, that's daylight. Vampires can't operate effectively in direct sunlight. Correct, which is why Mr. Ashford will have limited capability during the assault. But it's also why Confederate won't expect daytime raid. Their security is designed for nocturnal threats. Hitting them at noon gives us tactical surprise. At what cost if he's compromised by sunlight, we're conducting extraction without our primary asset? Dominic spoke for the first time since arriving, his voice carrying 4 centuries of command authority, that retirement hadn't completely erased. I'll function long enough. Sunlight burns limits, regeneration reduces speed and strength. But I've operated in daylight before. Europe's summer of 1944. Daylight raids were standard because German forces had learned to fortify at night. It's survivable if you're willing to accept the cost. The cost being second-degree burns across any exposed skin, cellular damage that would take days to heal completely, and reduced combat effectiveness that turned supernatural predator into merely exceptional human soldier. But exceptional human soldier backed by 12 special operations veterans was still sufficient force for facility if tactical surprise work. Insertion by a civilian vehicle approach from east, where their surveillance is lightest, breach perimeter at weakest point here. Nathan indicated location on displayed schematic and pushed straight for research wing where prisoner is being held. Extraction via same route with Plan B being commandeer facility vehicles if primary extraction is compromised. What about the weapon they're developing, Daybreak? Mission priority is prisoner extraction. But if opportunity presents, we destroy research data and synthesize compounds. Secondary objective, not primary, but worth pursuing if tactical situation allows. The contractors exchanged glances that carried volumes of unspoken concern. This was suicide mission dressed up with tactical language, high-risk extraction, with minimal support and exit strategy that depended entirely on surprise lasting long enough to reach the prisoner. Every man in this warehouse understood that some of them wouldn't come back. The question was whether they believed the objective justified that cost. Finally, Jackson spoke for the group. "We're in, but sir," he addressed Dominic directly. "If this goes wrong, if we're captured or killed, we're doing it because we saw her walk out to save people she didn't know. That meant something. Don't make us regret believing it meant enough to die for." "I won't." The convoy left at civilian SUVs that wouldn't attract attention on highways where military vehicles would trigger immediate response. Dominic rode in the lead vehicle, watching California landscape pass while his mind ran through tactical scenarios that all ended in casualties. Acceptable losses. Except this time, he was the one spending lives instead of preserving them. And the mathematics felt different when you were asking people to volunteer for suicide mission instead of ordering them into one. The UV-resistant gear helped but didn't eliminate the problem of daylight operation. Dominic could feel sunlight through the vehicle's windows, that particular burning sensation of cells dying faster than supernatural healing could compensate. By the time they reached the facility, he'd be operating at maybe 60% capacity. Sufficient for combat, inadequate for anything requiring full supernatural abilities. Nathan drove with the careful precision of someone who'd conducted insertions before maintaining speed that matched traffic patterns without attracting attention. "Sir, about what happens after. Council's going to charge you with desertion, unauthorized military operations, probably treason for conducting raid against facility holding legally transferred prisoner. Even if we succeed, you're looking at court-martial." "I know. And you're okay with that." Dominic watched forests give way to agricultural land, thinking about Claire walking through Fort Ashford's gate with dignity that 412 years of military service hadn't done. "I've spent 4 centuries following orders, making pragmatic decisions, accepting that some promises had to break because keeping them cost too much. And where did that get me? Relieved of command for tactical incompetence. 83 soldiers dead. One woman who kept better faith than I did walking back into captivity. If court-martial is the price for finally keeping a promise that matters, I'll pay it." The facility appeared at 11:47 hours chain-link fence with razor wire surrounding compound that looked exactly like decommissioned military installation repurposed for civilian use. No obvious security, no guards visible, just the institutional architecture of government buildings left to deteriorate. But intelligence showed the interior was anything but abandoned. 100 security personnel advanced research laboratories holding cells designed for containing prisoners who weren't expected to leave. The perimeter breach went smoothly, cutting through fence at a point surveillance apparently considered too obvious to monitor closely. Professional security focused on likely approach vectors, not the blatantly obvious ones that amateurs would use. Nathan's team exploited that gap, moving through with the coordinated silence of operators who'd done this enough times to make it look easy. Then they reached the building's exterior, and daylight stopped being theoretical problem and became immediate tactical limitation. Dominic felt his skin start blistering as soon as he stepped from the vehicle, direct sunlight hitting exposed flesh with the effect of chemical burn. The UV-resistant gear helped but couldn't eliminate the fundamental incompatibility between vampire physiology and solar radiation. He moved anyway, forcing damaged tissue to function through sheer discipline, following his team through door they'd breached with shaped charges. Interior corridors were blessedly dark fluorescent lighting instead of natural sun. Dominic's healing factor began catching up burnt skin, regenerating enough to restore partial function. Not full capacity that would take hours, but sufficient for what came next. Confederate security responded within 90 seconds, moving with the professional coordination of personnel who trained for facility breach. But they trained for nocturnal threats, vampires attacking under cover of darkness, when supernatural abilities peaked. Encountering 12 human contractors in one daylight, compromised vampire at noon had clearly not been their primary scenario planning. The firefight was brutal and brief. Nathan's team moved with precision that came from decades of combined experience, each contractor covering specific sectors with disciplined fire. Dominic took point despite reduced capacity, using 412 years of combat experience to compensate for diminished speed and strength. He was slower than normal, weaker, but still faster and stronger than any human. That differential was enough. The research wing appeared exactly where intelligence indicated reinforced doors that required additional breaching charges. Past that, laboratories filled with equipment Dominic didn't recognize, and holding cells designed with medical precision. Most were empty. 2 contained bodies that had clearly been dead for days. Old blood carriers who'd been drained of genetic material and then disposed of when they stopped being useful. Claire was in the 3rd cell, sitting on a medical bed with the calm awareness of someone who'd expected rescue but hadn't counted on it. She looked up as Dominic entered, her blue eyes showing surprise for exactly 2 seconds before professional survival instinct reasserted control. You came. I keep my promises. Eventually. Nathan appeared at the doorway, tactical assessment overriding reunion sentiment. Sir, we've got maybe 3 minutes before Confederate forces rally and overwhelm our position. We need to move. But Dominic had seen what was in the adjacent laboratory vials of synthesized compound centrifuges, running continuous separation protocols, data terminals displaying molecular structures he didn't understand but knew represented daybreak. The weapon Confederate had spent years developing, the thing that would kill millions of humans, along with every vampire it touched. Burn it, all of it. Research data, synthesized compounds, everything. Sir, that's not primary objective. It is now. Claire, where's Colonel Hargrove? She stood slowly, hospital clothing hanging loose on her diminished body. The administrative section probably reviewing the collateral damage assessment. He's your problem, not mine. The assessment carried weight that suggested she'd seen something in Hargrove that Dominic hadn't anticipated. But there wasn't time for detailed explanation. Nathan was already setting thermite charges on research equipment, preparing to burn everything Confederate scientists had built. 1,200 degrees would reduce genetic samples and molecular compounds to ash that couldn't be recovered or reproduced without starting from scratch. Hargrove appeared as they were leaving the research wing, flanked by 2 security officers who immediately moved to intercept. But the colonel raised his hand, stopping them with gesture that suggested he wanted this confrontation. Commander Ashford, I assume you're here for Miss Morrison, and to destroy your weapons program. Noble, tactically pointless. We have backup samples at other facilities. Destroying this location just delays deployment by 3 months. Then I'll destroy those facilities too. Hargrove studied him with the particular assessment of career officers evaluating opponents. You're willing to spend your life and your contractors' lives for a weapon program you can't stop. That's not tactical thinking. That's sentiment disguised as strategy. Maybe, but I've spent 400 years making tactical decisions that turned out to be strategically worthless. If sentiment is what's left when tactics fail, I'll take it. Something shifted in Hargrove's expression. Professional control acted to show the exhausted veteran underneath. I built this weapon to avenge my son, to protect humanity from vampire predation, to ensure no other father had to kill their child because vampires infected them. And in the process, you built something that will kill millions of humans, including your grandson. I saw the casualty projections. 15 to 20% collateral damage means Tyler dies along with everyone else vulnerable to compounds targeting regenerative cellular structures. The accuracy of that assessment hit Hargrove visibly all pretense, evaporating to show grief that hadn't dulled in 20 years. I know, I reviewed the data this morning, spent 20 years building a weapon that would murder the only family I have left. Then destroy it yourself. Order your security to stand down. Let us burn this facility and everything in it. Choose your grandson over your vendetta. For a moment that stretched impossibly long, Hargrove stood at decision point between continuing crusade that would kill his family or abandoning it despite 2 decades of investment. Professional officer against grieving father duty, against love, mathematics, that justified any cost against reality, that some cost destroyed everything they were meant to protect. Finally, he spoke with the exhausted finality of someone who just surrendered to enemy he couldn't defeat. All personnel stand down. Allow hostile forces to complete facility destruction and withdraw without interference. That's an order. His security officers exchanged confused glances, but lowered their weapons' professional discipline, overriding personal confusion. Hargrove had command authority. His orders would be followed even when they contradicted everything Confederate military logic said should happen. Nathan didn't waste time questioning unexpected cooperation, just activated the thermite charges that would reduce research laboratories to slag. 3,000 degrees of chemical fire that would destroy genetic samples, synthesize compounds research data, everything Confederate had built toward deploying Daybreak. The facility would survive structurally, but the weapons program wouldn't. The extraction went smoother than any tactical projections suggested it should. Confederate forces maintained distance, following Hargrove's stand-down order, despite obvious confusion about why their commander was allowing enemy forces to destroy years of research. Dominic suspected Hargrove would face court-martial for this decision relief, from command at minimum, possibly imprisonment, for allowing strategic asset to be destroyed. But the colonel had apparently decided that some costs were too high, even for vengeance pursued across 2 decades. The convoy reached Fort Ashford at 1843 hours, carrying 12 contractors who'd survived the extraction and 1 prisoner who'd been traded away 12 hours ago, and now representing evidence that Vampire Command's decisions could be reversed through unauthorized military action. Marcus met them at the perimeter, his scarred face showing complex mix of relief and concern that suggested the past 18 hours had been politically complicated. You succeeded. Against tactical probability and command authorization, you actually succeeded. Claire's alive. Daybreak is destroyed. I'd call that success. Council calls it desertion and unauthorized military operations. They've scheduled court-martial for tomorrow morning. You, Nathan, and every contractor who participated. Charges include treason, conduct unbecoming, and about 17 violations of military protocol. Dominic had expected this, had accepted it before leaving. Some promises required paying costs that tactics said were unacceptable. Understood, I'll surrender for custody immediately. Or Marcus's voice carried the particular weight of someone about to propose an option he knew was terrible. You could disappear, take Claire leave, Fort Ashford, go somewhere council jurisdiction doesn't reach. Nathan's already arranged new identities, financial resources, everything needed to start over. The offer was tactically sound and ethically questionable, oddly the kind of pragmatic solution Marcus excelled at finding. It would save Dominic from court-martial, save contractors from charges they'd face for following his orders, save Vampire Command from having to prosecute a beloved officer whose only crime was keeping promises command said. But it would also prove that promises only mattered when convenient, that military structure meant nothing if command could be ignored without consequence, that 4 centuries of service ended with running instead of facing judgment for decisions made. No, I'll stand trial, accept whatever council decides. But Marcus, Dominic gestured to contractors who'd risk court-martial for mission they believed mattered. They followed my orders. This is command failure, not subordinate disobedience. Doesn't work that way. They volunteered knowing the consequences. Counsel will charge them regardless of who gave orders. Claire spoke for first time since returning her voice carrying quiet authority that didn't match hospital clothing or diminished frame. Then let me testify. Tell counsel exactly what happened at that facility, what Confederate was building, what the collateral damage projections showed. Maybe knowing the truth changes their mathematics. The trial convened at 0900 hours in Fort Ashford's formal council chamber. All senior officers present to deliver judgment on actions that had violated every protocol while achieving objectives command said were impossible. Dominic stood at the defendant's position, flanked by Nathan and the 12 contractors who'd participated in unauthorized extraction. Marcus presided. His role shifted from prosecutor to judge because he'd been complicit in providing intelligence. Helena Graves, who'd been the sole council member supporting Dominic's original decision, served as defense advocate, though her arguments would matter less than the evidence in testimony that established what had actually occurred. The charges were read formally: desertion, unauthorized military operations conduct, unbecoming an officer, theft of classified intelligence, and treason for destroying Confederate facility that held legally transferred prisoner. Each charge carried penalties ranging from imprisonment to execution, depending on counsel judgment about whether actions constituted forgivable error or unforgivable betrayal. Claire's testimony changed the mathematics. She described the facility, the research protocols, the casualty projections, showing daybreak would kill 15 to 20% of humans in deployment zones. She explained Hargrove's revelation that his grandson would die from the weapon he'd spent 20 years building. She detailed the choice Confederate colonel had made between vengeance and family, between duty and love, between mathematics that justified anything and reality that some cost destroyed everything. When she finished, silence filled the chamber with weight that made concrete walls feel fragile. Counsel had spent 3 years fighting. Confederate forces had accumulated thousands of casualties, had developed institutional hatred for enemy that used UV weapons and blessed silver and chemical agents designed to kill vampires efficiently. Learning that Confederates' ultimate weapon could also kill millions of humans added complexity that tactics could easily accommodate. Helena delivered closing argument with the passionate precision of someone who'd spent 3 centuries navigating vampire politics. Dominic Ashford violated protocol. He ignored command authority. He conducted unauthorized military operation. But he also destroyed weapon that would have killed not just vampires, but millions of humans. He kept promise, command said, should have been broken, and in doing so prevented genocide that would have made our species extinct and murdered more humans than vampires have killed in recorded history. If that's treason, then I'm not sure I understand what loyalty means anymore. The council vote took 3 hours. Deliberation happened behind closed doors. 12 officers deciding whether unauthorized heroism counted as heroism or just unauthorized. When they returned, Marcus delivered the verdict with the exhausted formality of someone who just spent 3 hours arguing positions he didn't entirely believe. On charges of desertion, unauthorized military operations, and conduct unbecoming, guilty. However, given extenuating circumstances and strategic value of destroyed weapons program, counsel recommends sentence of time served plus permanent retirement from active military service. Dominic Ashford is hereby officially and irrevocably retired with honors, effective immediately. Nathan Reeves and associated contractors are reprimanded, but face no criminal charges. Given they followed orders from officer they believed was acting as command authority. The sentence was simultaneously generous and final. Dominic would avoid imprisonment or execution, but his 412-year military career was definitively over. No returning to command, no tactical advisory roles, no future where he wore uniform or gave orders or made decisions that got soldiers killed. He was civilian now, permanently separated from the only life he'd known since Gettysburg. He discovered he was okay with that. 6 months later, Dominic sat in a small office in Ashford Village, Oregon, the village that had been destroyed twice and was now being rebuilt with vampire resources and human labor working in genuine cooperation. The office technically belonged to Claire, who'd accepted position as civilian liaison officer, responsible for reviewing protection orders and ensuring bureaucratic failures, like the one that had cost her family, didn't repeat. But today, they were reviewing intelligence reports together because old blood families remained at risk. Confederates' weapons program had been destroyed, but the concept had proven itself viable. Other groups would attempt similar research, would hunt for old blood carriers, would try to weaponize genetic material that could neutralize vampire immortality. Claire marked locations on a map where intelligence suggested old blood families might still exist. Tennessee has 3 potential family lines. Texas has 2. Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine each have 1. All isolated, all vulnerable, all completely unaware. They carry genetic markers that make them targets. We'll need to find them before anyone else does. Offer protection, relocation assistance, whatever they need. We, meaning who exactly? You're retired. I'm civilian liaison. We don't have authority for protection operations. Dominic smiled, feeling the weight of 4 centuries lift fractionally. Then we'll do it anyway, without authority, without orders, just because promises matter more than protocol. Claire studied him with the particular assessment of someone who'd learned to read people through 18 years of surviving systematic horror. You're planning to spend the rest of your immortal life tracking down old blood families and protecting them from whoever comes next. That's your penance for failing me twice. Penance implies obligation. This is choice. Same thing, different framing. Maybe she was right. Maybe he was just finding new ways to feel guilty about old failures. But sitting in this office, working with someone who kept faith better than he deserved, planning operations that would protect people who didn't know they needed protecting, that felt more like purpose than penance. Marcus appeared in the doorway, still in uniform, because he'd accepted permanent command of Fort Ashford when Council decided someone needed to fix what Dominic's leadership had broken. Got intelligence report you'll want to see. Confederate remnants are reforming in Texas, possibly attempting to restart gateway programs using backup data hardware claimed didn't exist. Of course it exists. Weapons programs always have backups, which means your retirement might be shorter than Council intended. Someone needs to destroy those facilities before Confederate synthesizes another batch of genocide. And since you're already retired with nothing to lose, you're asking me to conduct more unauthorized military operations. I'm suggesting that sometimes the right thing requires ignoring what's authorized. You taught me that, eventually. Dominic looked at Claire, reading her expression with accuracy born from 6 months working together. What do you think? I think promises matter more than tactics. I think some people are worth protecting even when mathematics says they're not. And I think maybe we're going to Texas. 3 hours later, they were in a vehicle heading south, following intelligence that suggested Confederate remnants were attempting exactly what everyone had feared. Behind them, Fort Ashford continued its operations under Marcus's pragmatic command. Ahead somewhere in Texas, people who didn't know they carried old blood were being hunted by forces that wanted to restart what Hargrove had abandoned. It wasn't the ending Dominic had expected when he'd picked up that M1911 with silver bullets 6 months ago. He'd anticipated one final war or final bullet quick conclusion to 4 centuries of accumulated failure. Instead, he'd found something that looked suspiciously like purpose, protecting people who needed protection. Keeping promises, the man said, should have been broken, proving that maybe individual lives mattered more than tactical optimization. Claire dozed in the passenger seat, exhausted from 6 months of rebuilding herself after 18 years of systematic destruction. The insignia hung around her neck again. Dominic had returned it formally, insisted she keep it because she'd earned ownership through 20 years of faith he didn't deserve. She'd accepted with the quiet dignity that characterized everything she did now. Neither grateful nor resentful, just acknowledging that some things mattered enough to hold on to, even when holding them cost everything. Texas sprawled ahead, seized and complicated, and full of people who would die if Dominic didn't find them first. The mathematics said saving them all was impossible. Confederate had too many resources, too much motivation, too many backup plans. But mathematics had been wrong before. Sometimes sentiment succeeded where tactics failed. Sometimes keeping promises mattered more than calculating acceptable losses. Dominic had 412 years of experience, proving that war never ended, that causes were usually lies, that promises broke under pressure. But he also had one example of someone who'd kept faith through systematic horror designed to destroy faith completely. If she could do that, if a 7-year-old's promise could survive 20 years and 18 different masters, and genetic exploitation that nearly killed millions, then maybe 4 centuries of failure had taught us the most important lesson, that soldiers didn't stop fighting because the cause was lost. They stopped when they forgot what they were fighting for. He remembered now, and Texas was just the beginning.